Intelligence reports indicate that a high-ranking enemy leader, Maxwell, has visited a camp in Sector U, the mercenary headquarters in Africa. The general said in French, "This will be his last night. Of course, given the nature of the operation, we cannot deploy many people. There are 49 people from 5 units here, and of course there will be no air support," he said. One of the soldiers asked how many men the enemy had, and it turned out that the minimum was 350 and the maximum was 500. Sitting among the soldiers, Darren did not know French, so he asked a comrade named Charlie to translate, but he asked him to shut up. The general continued to say that the goal of the operation was not suppression by fire. After killing Maxwell, everyone should stop fighting and retreat. Darren turned back to the boy to see what the man was saying. However, at that moment, the general shouted at the distracted young men. All attention was focused on Charlie. The guy sat in a confident pose with a stern face and looked at the boss. He ordered them not to be distracted. The young man asked the commander to continue his monologue. The man looked at Charlie with irritation. They pierced each other with their eyes. The general replied that at any other time he would have responded, but today he would ignore it. "Today is a very important day for all of us," he said. Charlie had been listening to him attentively all this time. Soon their meeting ended and the military was ordered to go and get ready. A few hours later, a quiet and gloomy night set in. Only the noise from the engine disturbed the tranquility of nature. In the military vehicle, everyone was asleep and snoring, except Charlie. When the transport stopped, the young man jumped to the ground and began to wake everyone up, because from this place they would go on foot. Once everyone was on their feet, he warned everyone to check their gear and weapons, and for now, they could take a smoke break. Then Stephen approached Captain Charlie, who had just started smoking. Holding a cigarette in his teeth, the comrade winked. He asked if they would go today after the mission, but did not finish the sentence, but showed a vulgar, obscene gesture with his hands. Charlie got angry because the blonde's head was filled with other things. Now it was more important to think about survival. Stephen lit a cigarette and calmly said, "What's the problem? Because the god of Blackfield is next to us." The captain smiled indulgently and soon threw his cigarette on the ground, saying that they were finished. He stubbed out the cigarette butt that had fallen to the ground with his boot, and the whole team moved forward after the leader. The team made their way through the jungle very quietly and carefully. Suddenly, the captain gestured for everyone to stop. There were about 2 kilometers left to the destination. So far, everything was going smoothly, but what is this strange feeling of anxiety that Charlie has? Stephen asked him what was the matter. He noted that the captain looked somehow unwell. The young man shared that he had a bad feeling. The blonde grinned. Was the god of Blackfield sure? At this point, the military man laughed, deciding to joke that the captain was about to retire. However, something interrupted his speech. At that moment, Stephen received a bullet in the stomach and began to bleed. Immediately, many bullets flew at the team. Charlie ordered everyone to duck immediately. The boys hid behind the trees, which were being fired upon from all sides. A terrible attack began on them. The bullets never ended. In the midst of all this horror, Charlie dragged his comrade. The wounded Stephen was bleeding and not moving at all. The captain was terribly worried about him, trying to save him with all his might. Somehow, the young man managed to reach a tree for shelter. What is this, a mortar attack? It doesn't look like we caught them by surprise, Charlie thought. He asked a subordinate hiding nearby if everyone was okay, and it turned out that everything was fine for now. The enemies knew in advance that they were coming, so there were more of them and they were in cars. People fired at the detachment with automatic weapons and machine guns. Dodging the bullets, Charlie tried to shoot back. The young man shot 2 enemies in the head who were driving a car with machine guns, and immediately after, a bullet pierced the windshield and killed the driver. The car lost control and crashed into several people at high speed, crashing into a tree. Charlie approached Stephen and asked if he should be given morphine. The blonde replied that it was not necessary. He did not even understand where he was. After examining his body, the captain realized that the bleeding was severe and that the internal organs were also affected. He encouraged his comrade by assuring him that he only had a scratch and there was nothing to be afraid of. One of the guys turned to Charlie. "What are we going to do?" The guy understood that Stephen was seriously injured, and if they wanted to survive, they had to retreat. "Captain, you understand everything," Stephen groaned. Writhing in pain, he asked to leave. "You're crazy," Charlie thought, gritting his teeth. The young man shouted at his comrade and began to ask furiously, "Who am I?" The soldier was breathing heavily, sweat running down his face. He repeated his question even louder, placing his hands on his shoulders. Stephen smiled, looking at the captain, and he said, "You are the god of Blackfield." At this moment, an explosion is heard nearby. The shell-shocked young man doesn't understand what this is. Suddenly, he hears someone nearby groaning in pain. It was Darren making those sounds, so Charlie turned to face him. The wounded Darren insisted that everything was fine, hiding behind a tree that was currently being furiously fired upon. The captain begged him to hold on a little longer. They were practically at the camp. After these words, Charlie ran straight into the bullets, but almost immediately his skull is pierced by an enemy attack. Everything suddenly started spinning and the ground started slipping out from under my feet. A moment later, the young man fell, bleeding, barely able to see anything around him. Lying on the ground in his own blood, Charlie suddenly realized that someone had shot him in the head from behind. The enemy began to approach their group. The captain's eyes slowly darkened. Only one thought remained with him until his death. A sniper? Who was it? After that, the young man passed out. There was darkness all around. The back of his head was splitting with pain. He was very thirsty. Was the young man dead? The barely distinguishable voices of people could be heard all around. The light slowly penetrated his eyes. The voices were in Korean. "You are lucky, you are young, so you recover quickly," someone said. The picture and sounds became clearer and clearer. The doctor said, "Student, are you awake?" Finally, the guy opened his eyes and a bright light hit them. The doctor standing next to the patient asked the nurse to check the numbers. As it turned out, patient Charlie Ross had regained consciousness, so the nurse called the doctor. The worried doctor turned to him. He began to check his vision with a flashlight. The doctor assumed that due to the fact that the young man had previously been involved in sports, he was recovering quickly. The doctor began to ask the young man about his mood and well-being. At the same time, the man took out some cotton wool with tweezers. While his face was being wiped with it, the patient was able to quietly ask, "What is this place?" He was told that he was in Sebiol Hospital in Gangnam. The doctor asked the nurse to contact the relatives, as the young man was in a stable condition. If it's Gangnam, then it's definitely Korea, but who brought it here? The doctor answered quite calmly that it was an ambulance. The patient couldn't believe this nonsense. How could there be an ambulance where he was? The man asked the nurse to look after him, as the student woke up 3 days later and was not fully recovered. Charlie stood up abruptly. He was indignant that everyone was calling him a student. Then he noticed something. He quickly got out of bed and onto the floor barefoot. The doctor wanted to warn him that it was too early for him to get up, but the guy had already headed to the other end of the ward. The patient walked up to the mirror and dug his hands into the sink. Charlie touched his reflection and was horrified. He was in the body of a young student guy. What is that? After a few days in the hospital, the boy was heading home. The boy knew his name was Charlie Ross and that he was 29 years old. Profession: commander of a detachment of mercenary forces of France. In July 2016, Charlie was on a battlefield in Africa when he was knocked unconscious by gunfire. It would be more accurate to say that the young man died on the battlefield. And in 2019, he woke up in South Korea. The guy was in a coma for 3 days but woke up because he switched bodies. The most amazing thing is that here his name is also Charlie Ross, only he is 19 and a senior in his senior year. He goes to Sinman High School in Gangnam, fell from the roof of the school building, lost consciousness, and came to his senses 3 days later. That's what Charlie was told. But naturally, it was not he who came to his senses, but I, thought the young man. He was distracted from his thoughts by a female voice asking if he remembered the house where he lived. Sitting next to him is a woman named Sophia Ross. She is his mother. Their conversation is interrupted by the driver, who asks Sophia not to rush. "The doctor said that the memory will return if you avoid unnecessary stress and rest more," said Jim, the student's father. After a while, they drove up to the house. Their car pulled into a free parking space in front of the entrance, and the father invited everyone to come inside. They went up to the floor and entered the apartment. The mother asked again if her son remembered his home, but the father interrupted her. He hugged Charlie and asked him not to worry about anything, and to go and rest in his room. The young man was faced with a choice: which door to enter to get into his room. Father kindly suggested that his bedroom was on the left. Ross tugged the door handle carefully. He stopped and suddenly looked back unnoticed, after which he immediately went inside. Mom and Dad looked after him with excitement. When they were alone, they shared their concerns about their son. Meanwhile, Charlie admired the room, which was 100 times better than the personal room of the mercenary commander. This kid was just a rich guy. The most important thing among all of this is that the workplace with a computer is the most pleasing. The student decided to turn it on by pressing the button. He settled into a comfortable chair, however. A login password appeared on the screen, which he, naturally, did not know. There was a telephone lying on a stand on the table, which caught his attention. The young man took it, because you can use the internet on your smartphone. Unfortunately, it also had a password set. Charlie didn't understand why so many passwords were set. Here he feels a round surface on the back of the phone. Thanks to his fingerprint, he was able to unlock the phone. It was obvious because Charlie was in the body of the owner of this phone. Who knows, maybe he will be able to find some thread leading to the solution of his death and transfer into this body. However, an internet search for 2016 Battle in Africa Masalan yielded no results. Maybe it's because the boy was searching for it in Korean. Ross typed the same query but in English. There were no results, so he decided to try French. He was interrupted by an unexpected message from Lewis Clark. "Charlie, I heard you were discharged from the hospital?" asked the blonde. It was unclear whether this guy was his friend or not. He had to quickly answer something and continue his business. "Yes, I just got discharged," the young man replied. However, the next message surprised Charlie. Clark began to snap back in an insulting tone and say why he didn't report this to him. Did he really want to die? Ross was confused. Wasn't this the student's friend? But it didn't matter, so he continued what he had started. But Louis didn't finish writing. He complained about why he wasn't answering him. This guy had already begun to irritate the former captain with his obsession. To get rid of him, the young man wrote that he was busy. After that, he immediately received a call on his phone. The guy smiled with interest at Clark's reaction. The student picked up the phone and immediately began to shout insults at him. His screams brought a smile to Ross's face. "He's become completely brazen. He swallowed a bunch of drugs in the hospital to gain courage," Louis said. The young man calmly repeated that he was busy and warned that he was hanging up, which caused an even greater storm of emotions in his interlocutor. The blonde started to threaten, but was cut off by the brunette who hung up. Charlie assumed that he would call him again. "That's why I blocked his contact on my account." At this time, screams could be heard from the roof of the school. Louis was furious that Charlie had dared to block him. In anger, he threw the phone so hard that its glass cracked. Clark was breathing heavily. He was terribly angry. There was only hatred in his eyes. One of his friends asked him why he was throwing phones around. "I don't care. I'll just tell that idiot Charlie to buy me another one," the bully said. His friend started laughing at him. "Did Louis ever spend his cash on anything?" "Just come to school, Ross," Clark said menacingly. Soon night fell in the city. The brunette was still sitting at the table in his room. He looked through various news articles but couldn't find any mention of that battle. Was it a security measure or some other reason? Thoughts about this did not give him peace. That's why such a large flow made him want to smoke. The young man began to search the shelves. Perhaps the student had something hidden away. But after searching, it became clear that this puppy was apparently really an excellent student. There was still hope that he hid the pack among the books. When Charlie opened one of the cabinets, he saw a lot of trash. Taking one of the notebooks, he thought that it would be an ideal place for a stash. However, instead of cigarettes, he found the student's notes. "I gave them money today, and still, I don't understand why these guys are treating me like this. Where did I go wrong? I didn't do anything." Charlie read the pages where the boy described his suffering, where he had already begun to believe in his insignificant existence because of his offenders. It was scary. Ross thought that Lewis's behavior was strange. So this kid is an outcast? Every page was covered with vows to kill those bastards who had bullied him. What a fool, Charlie thought. If you want to kill someone, just go and kill them quietly. In the end, no cigarettes were found, and this kid turned out to be some kind of scapegoat. One way or another, the young man was very tired and lay down on the bed. As soon as he closed his eyes, he immediately fell asleep. A few hours later, a new day began. In the morning, Charlie's father drove him to school. The young man himself sat sullenly in the back seat. Jim saw his son's condition in the rearview mirror and was very worried about his son. After some time, they finally arrived at the school gates. My father asked, "Are you sure you're okay? You could stay at home for a couple of days." Charlie came to his senses a little and replied that everything was fine. Jim smiled and asked not to strain himself too much. The student smiled politely in response and agreed. The young man got out of the car and walked into the schoolyard. Only now did he realize that he didn't know which office he needed to go to. He looked around. There were many students around. It would be nice if someone showed him everything here. Suddenly, someone from the crowd called out to Charlie. At that very moment, everyone around began to whisper and glance sideways. Lewis walked confidently towards him and said cheekily, "Isn't this the same Charlie who grew balls of steel in the hospital?" The young man looked at the blonde man carefully. He saw that his badge said Louis Clark and realized that this was the same man he had spoken to on the phone. The enraged hooligan shouted loudly, reminding them of their conversation yesterday. Charlie began to smile, chuckling a little. "What are you laughing at? Have you been sniffing glue?" Lewis started snapping. Ross's face was beaming with happiness. His guidebook was in front of him. But Clark's facial expressions indicated that a fight was about to happen. Not understanding what the young man was talking about, the blonde asked him again. "You are Lewis Clark, aren't you?" Charlie asked happily. "Yes, bastard. I am Lewis Clark, to whom you always brought cigarettes and lunches without question," the hooligan yelled throughout the yard. Without any embarrassment, the brunette asked to give him a cigarette if he had one. Ross extended his hand with a friendly smile. Clark began to flex his fists. He wanted to wait until lunch, but the student apparently couldn't wait. He ordered the brunette to follow him, quickly turning away and walking away. He didn't even doubt that Charlie would not follow him. Soon the two of them entered the empty gym. After walking forward a little, Louis stopped. He turned around with a grin, looking at the young man. The blonde was the first to decide to start intimidating Charlie, aiming punches at him. "Do you know how hard it was for me without you?" said the impudent Clark. His fists froze in the air, a few centimeters from the student's face. "Bastard, did you want to die?" Clark said. But his verbal attack was interrupted by a powerful blow to the face from Ross. "Why are you talking so much?" asked the brunette. Louis flew a couple of meters away from him from the force of the blow. But Charlie immediately runs up to his body. And again he swings for another hard blow. His hand moves towards the guy's head at an insane speed. But suddenly the brunette stops himself. He understands that if he fights seriously, he might kill the bully. But he doesn't want to do that. Charlie decided to search the hooligan's pockets in the hope of finding cigarettes. But unfortunately, he didn't have any cigarettes. The young man decided to leave Louis lying there. The guy was lost in his thoughts. In his head, Ross began to address the student. "You see this? I don't know where you are now, but you can look at this and calm down a little." Meanwhile, behind his back, Louis began to come to his senses. Clark slowly began to rise to his feet. How angry he was at Charlie, who had suddenly become bolder. The blonde pushed away sharply and headed towards Ross to beat him up. The brunette himself noticed the enraged body approaching him. "You hit me in the face!" Ross tried to attack Clark, screaming, but he dodged. The next blow also missed the student, and the offended blonde said, "Are you crazy?" Charlie was alarmed that the bully recovered so quickly after his blow. To calm the rebellious brat, the brunette hit him in the face again. The force of the blow made it seem as if the place where it hit was smoking. Louis got really angry and stuttered and insulted the young man. Here, Charlie realized that he was not in his own body and the fist was not his. Therefore, the strength was different. Since I couldn't knock him out with one blow then, he was going to beat him until it had an effect. Once again, Louis received a punch in the same place. The guy pushed off the parquet floor to gain speed. Clark didn't give up and ran towards the student again. And again he missed, in addition to receiving a powerful, by body standards, uppercut. Ross's gaze was focused only on his target and his fist was aimed. And again, with a sharp and hard blow to the head, he knocks the hooligan off his feet. There was cruelty in his eyes and his fist never stopped hitting. The young man was very angry, and abrasions from the blows were already starting to appear on his arm. Hands covered in blood, eyes full of rage. Louis lay bloodied and unconscious on the floor. Charlie stared at him, his fist hanging in the air. At that moment, the student remembered. He wanted to find an office, so he stood up. Soon the guy left the gym. He looked around as he walked through the schoolyard, hoping to figure out where he needed to go. Suddenly, someone called out from behind Charlie. A pretty girl started to approach him. "At school already?" she asked. The young man still looked at her with incomprehension. A student who looked like Snow White started asking about the extract. The name tag said Kate Diaz, but what kind of relationship are they in? In any case, he was a third-year student, so it was not necessary to use a formal style of speech. Kate apologized for not being able to visit him, as additional tasks took precedence over her free time. Diaz shared that everyone in the class was worried about the boy's condition. "Are we classmates?" Ross asked the girl. "We sit at the same desk," the girl reminded. She began to reach her hand towards his head, afraid that something was wrong with her. But the young man dodged it and said that everything was fine. Charlie turned abruptly and called for her to come. Well, for starters, he will at least be able to find an office thanks to the girl. A little later, the guys entered the office. The young man sat by the window and realized that this was the perfect view for a shot. Here, the office doors opened suddenly. The whole class turned around to see who had entered. It turned out to be Louis, burning with anger and resentment, covered in blood. Everyone in the class started whispering about his broken face, assuming that he had gotten into trouble with the bullies from another school again. Charlie looked at him sideways. Is this puppy also a classmate? Without taking his eyes off Ross, Clark pushed back his chair. He sat against the opposite wall and deliberately turned around so as to pierce the impudent fellow with his gaze. The face, swollen and covered in blood, expressed hatred and disgust. Charlie didn't pay any attention to him. The guy was getting on his nerves. Louis took his phone out onto the table. He wrote to someone, "This Ross has gone completely crazy. Everyone leave during the first lesson. This bastard won't get off easy," Clark thought. The physical education lesson began. The whole class lined up in sports uniforms outside. The teacher looked carefully at those present in the class. "What about the uniform?" he asked Charlie, who was standing in his usual school uniform. Kate said in his defense that the young man had been in hospital for some time and had only recently returned. The coach quickly understood the situation and asked the guy not to strain himself too much and to rest in the shade. "Today you can play football, basketball, or dodgeball. The main thing is not to hurt yourself," the teacher announced. While the boys were playing football, the teacher stepped away for a while. Ross sat down on the steps alone. Louis noticed him immediately. Charlie's mind was filled with, "I was in an unclear situation one way or another. What to do next?" He was rudely interrupted by a hooligan who approached him. "Anything else to say?" Charlie asked. "You think you can get off that easy?" "Get up, let's move away," Clark answered fiercely. The blonde turned away and walked forward with an angry gait. "They won't understand until they die," the young man sighed. There was nothing else to do, so Charlie followed him. Charlie didn't show any emotion on his face, although he was a little curious about what was waiting for him. And soon they arrived at the place, where, besides the student and Louis, there were 5 more hooligans. "Haha, have you come?" The guy with the mask grinned. "Look at Louis's face," the thug began to mock. "Did Charlie really paint you like that?" The 5 hooligans began to smile evilly and prepare for a fight. And they hastened to surround one defenseless student. They were already waiting in anticipation of a fierce battle. Ross, looking at all this, smiled slyly. "What a show. Attack all together," he declared. The brute laughed. Was the guy's head still not working? One of the hooligans decided that he alone could teach the boy a lesson and swung his fist. Charlie instantly sensed danger from behind. And with a quick movement of his hand, he hit the guy in the jaw. The force sent the hooligan flying and rolling headfirst across the asphalt. Everyone gathered was in shock. They didn't expect this from an ordinary weakling. "When adults speak, you have to listen. There are 4 left," Ross said, smiling. The student decided to give them some advice. Since they didn't really understand, they shouldn't all aim at the same place. He ordered each of them to hit different places, distributing parts of his body between them. "And from different angles, okay?" Charlie asked. The irritated guy in the mask couldn't take it anymore and shouted, "Are you showing off by knocking one down?" After that, they all attacked the student together. Ross skillfully dodged the hooligans' blows, managing to inflict damage on them. But they ran towards him again, not wanting to retreat. Confident in his own strength, he was already taking aim at them. The first blow flew into the back of the guy with the mask. With the second, he hit the other man on the jaw with all his might, making him bleed. However, the guy was still on his feet, although he was staggering. So the next thing he did was punch him in the stomach. It felt like his hand went deep inside. Meanwhile, another hooligan woke up behind the student. He looked at the offender with hatred, and finding the strength in himself, he began to run at him from behind. He was able to grab Charlie by the hair at the back of his head. "Got you, you're finished," the bloody hooligan declared. But Ross watched the movement of the boy's fist closely. So as soon as he got close to his face, he successfully dodged. Charlie was unhappy that the enemy rose again after his blow. What a useless and weak body he has. But that didn't stop him from throwing the bastard forward through the bend. Louis watched in horror, not understanding how it happened. He looked at Charlie. Who was the loser? Was it him? His friend stood next to him, and he was terribly angry. He took out his knife and warned that the student was to blame for forcing him. "Don't draw your weapon unless you're prepared to give your life," Charlie told him. Of course, these words made the situation even worse, and the guy began to mindlessly wave the knife. Ross still managed to catch his hand with the weapon and stop him. The guy squeezed her and started to twist her. It was terribly painful for the hooligan. There was a crunching sound, and the attacker's face screamed in pain. Charlie let go of his hand and turned to Louis. "And here we are again, one-on-one," the brunette grinned. The recently beaten guy was afraid. He couldn't find the words. Charlie picked up the fallen knife and said, "Don't be too afraid. If you think about it, it's all my fault. Apparently I was too soft this morning. The day wasn't over yet. And you were already able to plan this," the student continued. He looked askance at the bully. Now he wouldn't make such a mistake. Fear gripped Clark. He was shaking. Charlie gave him a choice, a cut, or a break. Now Louis admitted he was wrong and assured him that he would not touch him anymore. However, at that moment Charlie heard someone's footsteps. He turned around angrily to see who it was. A teacher walked towards them, full of irritation. He gave a stern command, "Stop it!" Ross couldn't understand how the coach had managed to get so close without being noticed. And behind him, Louis, all in tears and snot, begged the teacher to save him. Charlie and the teacher stood opposite each other in terrible tension. "So you are that, Charlie. I heard about your situation, but you need to stop. This is no longer self-defense. This is beating," the man said. The young man did not answer, but looked at him with particular anger. "You bastard, just look at his eyes. If you don't stop, I'll make sure you get kicked out of school, even for what you just did. You could get into serious trouble," the teacher continued. Charlie responded with complete indifference that this meant he wouldn't go. How can a schoolboy not go to school? The coach didn't understand. "I'll take care of this, and you can go home. And a case will still be open, so if you have any evidence of their bullying, you can bring it." The teacher walked up to the wounded, and Charlie started to walk away. He understood that he didn't need to get involved with this man. Suddenly, the teacher turned to Charlie and asked him where he learned to fight like that. At first, the young man doubted it, but almost immediately answered that it was on the internet. The man was amazed by his strength and asked to come see him later for a talk. Ross didn't answer and walked away. The teacher looked after him and wondered if everyone really changed that much once they died and came back to life. A little later, the student was walking through the city streets. He thought that this was enough to avenge the owner of this body, and he could return to where he belonged. The young man went into a men's salon and got a haircut. Now he looked exactly like Charlie Ross. After that, he went into a cafe. He was greeted by a friendly employee. Sitting down at the table, Charlie asked for a chicken cutlet and a portion of rice. The woman shouted an order to the kitchen. All of this reminded him of his past. Then he was also sitting in a cafe and they brought him his order, rice with chicken. He looked at his plane ticket. Nearby, a child was asking his mother for a chicken cutlet and crying. The guy put his ticket on the table. It had a departure from Incheon to Paris written on it. Finally, Charlie was brought his dish. As expected, it tasted better eating with chopsticks. However, the taste is not quite the same as it once was. Suddenly, the phone started vibrating in my pocket. Ross looked at the screen and it turned out that it was his mother calling. The young man decided to pick up the phone and talk to her. Sophia started asking about what happened and wanted to come and talk to her son in person. But the guy said he would talk when he got home and that was it. Charlie cut the conversation off in irritation and slammed the phone down on the table too hard. The young man thought, "Maybe this is not my style." The image of the student standing on the roof of the school came to mind. He looked at the city at night, how high it was. Tears welled up in his eyes and his whole body shook. One last breath and he decided to jump. These thoughts made Charlie stab his chopsticks furiously into his food. In the end, for everyone, he was just recovering from suicide. At home sat an angry father who had learned about what had happened, and a worried mother. Jim suggested that his son began to act strangely after that incident, perhaps due to a short-term coma. Their dialogue was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Charlie walked into the room and his parents immediately noticed the change in his hairstyle. Father asked him to sit down for a moment, but Ross, without saying anything, went into his room. "You little bastard!" Dad shouted. His wife immediately began to calm him down. Almost immediately, the young man came out of his room with some notebooks. The brunette sat down at the table in front of them and put down his notebooks, saying that he wanted to show them something. "What is this?" asked the worried father. Charlie asked them to just take a look. Jim took one of the notebooks with distrust. Sophia took the second one, and they began to read. Instantly, fear appeared in the mother's eyes. Tears involuntarily flowed from her eyes as she read all the horror that her son wrote. Father couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a nightmare. Soon the parents were both crying in front of their son. Dad asked if it was all true. Hadn't they noticed that their son was being bullied at school? To which Charlie replied that this was all true and had been going on for a long time. "Then why didn't you say anything?" he shouted in rage. "I didn't want to make you worry and I was ashamed of myself for being so pathetic," the son admitted. "So since I survived that jump, I have nothing more to fear in this world," Charlie continued. The father calmed down and agreed with him. He sat down, still in a state of shock. Jim asked if the boy felt better after he had taken revenge. Charlie looked down, frowning slightly. The mother was worried that her son had damaged something. The guy answered briefly and not entirely confidently, "No." There was silence in the room for a while. Soon the father said that if this happened, then fine, but he would deal with it all himself. So he asked the family not to worry. Charlie looked at him questioningly. Jim asked him to promise that if something like this happened again, his son would definitely tell them. The young man confidently said that it was all in the past. "But still, give us your word. We are your parents. We have the right to know," Father insisted. With tear-stained eyes, the mother asked her son for forgiveness because they didn't even know all this. The young man looked with sympathy at the parents of the owner of this body. He began to delve into memories of his father and mother, about their apartment, which had been turned into a dump of empty alcohol bottles and dirty dishes. Then my father ran out of alcohol. He ordered his son and wife to bring him more. Charlie looked at his father with anger and resentment, and he threw a bottle at him and again shouted for someone to bring him a drink. That evening, shouts and curses were heard from their house. Charlie said he promised Jim to talk about everything. The parents didn't answer. They looked down somewhere in disappointment, lost in their thoughts. The student said that he would go and rest since their conversation was over. His father let him go. Just at that moment, someone called him. Jim said he understood and would transfer the money so he would call back later. Sophia immediately asked what happened. The husband shared that this was his client from France, who had problems. Some documents had disappeared, and they could not pass through customs. Charlie heard his father say that he was told to transfer 100,000 euros for the suppliers to deal with it. But that was about 130 million won. Mom said that in that case they needed to send the money quickly, otherwise they would lose even more. But they were stopped by Charlie, who asked to let him talk to the person in charge. Jim didn't expect such a proposal from his son at all. Just then he received another call and Charlie picked up the phone. The voice on the phone said, "Director, they say they'll throw everything away if the transfer isn't done in 30 minutes. If we don't take care of this sooner?" He was interrupted by Charlie, who asked to be connected directly with the client. The young man immediately indicated that he was the director's son, and since they had little time, they should quickly connect him with him. The voice on the phone asked to wait a minute. The father and mother were shocked by what was happening. The client joined the conversation and Jim's son began speaking to him in French. Charlie spent some time talking to the client in a foreign language. Neither father nor mother understood what was happening. Soon, Charlie said goodbye to the person on the other end of the phone. Giving the phone to Jim, Charlie said that they found the lost documents. It just happened. So there are no more problems with customs. The father was happy and shared that they sometimes have such force majeure situations, to which his son replied that this would not happen again. "I said that in that case I would set the Algerian mercenaries on them," Charlie said. Of course, he immediately said that he was joking so that his parents wouldn't worry. Mom decided to find out when the boy learned French because they don't teach it at his school. The son hesitated awkwardly and said, "On the internet." Mom smiled and patted Dad on the shoulder. "The current generation has gone too far." The student bowed and said, "If you are finished, then I will go and rest." Ross went to his room and lay on his bed for a long time, lost in thought. It looks like he will have to postpone his trip to France. His body is not in the best shape, and his head has not yet recovered. Besides, now he has a family. He lives with his parents. Charlie sighed heavily, thinking about all this. He decided that as soon as he recovered, he would leave immediately. Time passed and a new day came. Charlie went to school again. Everything is fine, of course, but does a student have nothing better to do than school? He thought. Since he was bored anyway, the young man decided to take a nap and settled down on his desk. He was disturbed by the uncultured Louis, who brazenly sat down in front of him and forced him to raise his head. Charlie was surrounded by the same hooligans who had been beaten up yesterday. The student asked if Clark was tired of all this. "Tired of it? We'll definitely give it to you today, so follow me," the blonde ordered. Not wanting to obey him, the student lay down on his desk again and sent the hooligan packing. Louis smiled strangely. Was the brunette really refusing? "So you don't care what happens to Kate Diaz?" the bully asked. After these words, Charlie stood up abruptly, asking if he had misheard. Seeing his opponent's reaction, Louis repeated with a cheeky smile, "Yes, Keith Diaz." "Who is this?" Ross asked quite sincerely, not understanding who they were talking about. The hooligans suddenly fell silent and were stunned by what they heard. "Just look at this idiot." The blonde was indignant, while the brunette tried to remember someone with that name. "She immediately ran to the roof as soon as she heard about you and you decided to forget her?" Clark was indignant. At that moment, Charlie suddenly remembered that it was his deskmate and instantly jumped up from his chair. Now his face reflected anger and he asked, "Where is she?" Louis was pleased with this reaction and smiled sarcastically. Soon they and Clark climbed up to the roof. Charlie looked carefully at the people in front of him. 7 hooligan boys, 4 girls, and Louis himself met him. They all looked at him with malicious glee and smiled, clearly preparing for the massacre. "Ross, you bastard, I tried especially hard for you today. You better get ready," the blonde declared. "There are girls here too," the young man thought. One of them, a blonde with makeup, noticed the guy. "What do you want to get?" she quipped. Charlie said sternly, "You 4, leave." The blonde clearly didn't like this tone, and she got angry. The girl decided not to delay and immediately approached him. She started yelling at him arrogantly, "Who are you anyway?" She was immediately shut up by a slap in the face. The impudent girl immediately fell to the floor from surprise and humiliation. She turned around, hurt and in tears, at the guy who hit her, covering her reddened cheek. "Get out of here or you'll die," Charlie explained coldly and sternly. The confused blonde looked back at the hooligans, seeking support there. Louis said they would pay Charlie back by asking the girls to close the door and leave. The insulted girl could barely hold back her tears, burning with shame. Standing on her feet, she ordered that the bastard be finished off. Ross watched the girls sideways until they left the roof. Then he turned to the crowd of guys and asked where Kate was. And at that moment, Diaz just entered the classroom. Her friend started asking her where she came from. Kate said that she came from home, but missed the bus she usually took. The girl asked where such interest came from. Was anyone looking for her? The friend, without saying anything, looked up, where the fight was about to take place. Not understanding anything, Diaz also looked up. Meanwhile, Louis revealed that he had deceived Charlie by saying, did he imagine himself to be a prince who had come running to help Snow White? Here Ross thought, but really, if you look at it that way, Kate really does look like Snow White. In that case, Ross had nothing to do here, which he announced to those gathered. The young man turned around and walked towards the exit from the roof. However, he was immediately surrounded by hooligans, blocking his path. Charlie didn't like this behavior of the boys. What? You want to try jumping off the roof again? Louis said disgustingly. It turns out you're a real piece of trash, the student responded to his attack. And then the realization comes to Charlie's mind. The blonde said, again. That is, last time. Ross asked the hooligans, was it because of you? Wow, you really lost your memory. I didn't even touch you. But you asked for help so much that you didn't even notice how you fell, Clark told him. The people who now surrounded the student now revealed their true faces of cruelty and deceit. You should have told me this earlier, the brunette said with unnatural coldness. It was clear that he was furiously irritated. Don't show off, today will be completely different. I've gathered all the strongest guys from the area. You're definitely finished, said Louis. One of the hooligans started walking straight towards the young man. A huge brute approached him. It seemed that he was twice as tall as the guy. The man looked at Charlie and said, no matter how you look at it, you look like a girl. He placed his large hand on his head, not believing that the young man was really so strong. Enraged by this attitude, the brunette, peeking out from under his arm, said, I really am strong. The young man grabbed the thug's wrist with all his might, and he dislocated his arm so much that he couldn't move from the pain. Covered in sweat and writhing in pain, the bully tried to somehow insult the guy. But at that very second, he received a knee in the face. Louis shouted in panic that he had warned them to be more careful. He ordered everyone else to hit everyone at once, and they ran to attack. Having thrown the big guy to the floor, Charlie headed towards the rest. One after another, he knocked out his opponents in the stomach, neck, face, someone with a kick to the jaw. Another guy got punched in the nose with all his might. Blood gushed out like a stream. At that moment, a hooligan with a knife approached Ross from behind and was already aiming at him. The young man successfully dodged the blow, carefully watching every movement. The brunette stood in such a way that he could grab the handle of the weapon. Then he twisted the bastard's wrist so hard that he dropped the knife. Fearing for his life, he began to shout, wait, wait! But it was too late. So his next move was to poke his fingers into his eyes so that he fell to his knees. The last one left was Louis. Charlie looked back at him. Ross walked around the knocked-out opponents and approached Clark, leaving them alone again. What kind of person are you who feels no remorse for nearly killing a schoolboy? The young man asked in a rage. Louis stood at the edge of the roof and begged the brunette not to come near him. However, Charlie was not going to stop. He decided to pay him back in the same coin. Trembling with fear, the blonde began to cover himself with his hands and call for help. But not just anyone, but a teacher whose appearance Ross never expected. He turned around and saw the teacher heading towards him. Is it him again? The coach thought irritably. The man shouted sharply, calm down quickly! Charlie began to suspect that this man was not an ordinary teacher. Here he turned his gaze to Louis and addressed him. I'll talk to you separately, he said, and commanded, take your guys out of here right now. Tears of happiness appeared in Clark's eyes. He was saved and immediately obeyed the teacher. The hooligans slowly and with some help from their comrades were able to leave the roof, leaving the teacher alone with Charlie. The teacher lit a cigarette and said, not even a day has passed and you did this again? Charlie wondered how he knew they were here. It turned out that Kate Diaz ran to him and told him everything. While smoking a cigarette, he asked what they were going to do with it. This kind of thing is really not okay, the teacher declared. What? The student asked him indignantly. Puppy, if you want to be a student, act like one. You'll regret it later, the man shouted at him. At that moment, a thought comes into Charlie's head. Is this just an accident or did the same thing happen to him as to me? The young man decided to test this thoroughly and said to him, hey, which naturally angered the teacher. Ross began to attack the man with his punches, but he dodged. How dare this student attack the teacher? It irritated him terribly. So he hit him back, but Charlie successfully dodged his powerful blow. They exchanged glances in the midst of a tense battle, and the coach even dropped his cigarette. The teacher continued to deliver a series of professional blows, which the student successfully dodged. In addition to dodging, he blocked and parried blows. The man continued to aim his large fist at the young man. However, each of his blows flew through the air, and not at the target. At one point, they both struck at the same time and dodged, missing. And finally they stopped in a fighting stance, holding their fists to each other's faces. The teacher was amazed. How could an ordinary high school student do this? The man asked the young man who he was. The guy grabbed his fist with his hand and smiled. I don't even know who I am. The teacher did not understand what the student meant. Charlie asked calmly and clearly, Who am I? After this phrase, the teacher was shocked. His eyes widened in surprise. Charlie repeated again, but this time he shouted loudly, Who am I? The teacher couldn't believe it. He asked him to tell the rest. Ross looked the man straight in the eye and said, God. And together they said, Blackfield. The teacher did not expect this at all. The man was amazed. Charlie smiled approvingly. It seemed his plan had worked. Later, the two of them came down from the roof and entered the reception area. The man turned out to be the reincarnated Darren. Charlie was curious why the guy spoke Korean so well. It turned out that Darren himself had no idea why this was so. He began the story, After you were hit. They dealt with me quickly too. I woke up in bed, as if I had woken up from a bad dream. It turned out that I was in Korea, and next to me in bed was supposedly my wife. Then I noticed that I spoke Korean quite fluently. Ross smiled and asked, Well, since it's you, do you have a light? Darren explained that smoking was prohibited here. What? Charlie asked, cheekily and disappointedly. What? Darren corrected him with a small grin. Ross swung sharply at the confused Darren for such impudence. He put his hand on his heart in fear to catch his breath. The teacher started shouting, That's it, I don't know anything. I said it's not allowed, so it's not allowed. What kind of nonsense is this? A student asks the teacher for a cigarette. Charlie asked in amazement if he really was a high school student, to which Darren replied, It doesn't matter what's inside. But you have the body of a high school student. I won't give you anything, even if you kill me. What a bastard. I understood everything. I myself have no desire to pollute the body. The student turned away offended. The boys looked at each other happily. Ross thought, It turns out that Ken Evans is Darren. Judging by his story, we have traveled to the same time. Did you enjoy your wife's embrace while I was in the hospital? The young man asked. Darren smiled and said, It wouldn't be a pity to kill her. This phrase infuriated the student, but the man asked him to be quiet. I am a teacher, and the commander is now a student. Charlie concluded that his comrade was in hiding. Here Darren decided to ask why Ross was behaving like this, since he had been reborn. Why not be an ordinary student? Do you think I enjoy dealing with children myself? Charlie asked, stating that they were pestering him. The young man shared that he does not intend to stay here for long and will return to France. Are you going to go back to the hell you barely escaped from? Darren asked, completely confused by the commander's decision. Charlie assured him that there was definitely someone behind all this. If he didn't find these bastards, how could he think calmly about those who died so unfairly? The comrades sat opposite each other and silently looked into each other's eyes. Darren broke the silence by saying that in that case he would go with him during the holidays. Ross smiled mischievously and asked, Hey, want to do a tour? The man frowned and answered sternly, What do you mean? I'm actually serious too. Don't reveal yourself and just stay here to live. Looking after those jerks, don't let them pick on me, the young man asked. To which the teacher replied, In any case, I was already quite well prepared and was going to deal with this. The student crossed his arms and said mockingly, Weren't you weakly prepared against children? What? Did your self-confidence diminish after death? However, Darren wasn't talking about the kids. He was asking if Charlie had noticed anything when he was fighting with those puppies. Don't you think that was too much for a child's fight? The man asked. Charlie calmly replied that there was nothing suspicious, since as long as there were no guns, it was just right for children's showdowns. Darren immediately started to get indignant. Commander, are you sure you're from Korea? But ordinary hooligans don't use knives and bats. Really? The young man was embarrassed and the man just sighed. The coach suggested that there was some kind of group behind them and Ross chimed in. Gangsters, really? I'm not completely sure yet, but I think the chances are high. I'll figure it out before the holidays and then we can go to France, said Darren. The grin on the commander's face made the man confidently declare that he was not joking. But Charlie already understood everything, so he suggested discussing it later. The student got up from the sofa and commanded, in the meantime, talk to the nurse. He headed towards the exit of the classroom and shared that he wanted to sleep until the end of classes. Darren had no choice but to watch his commander leave. After some time, near the medical office, someone's footsteps could be heard along the corridor. Until now, Charlie had been sleeping peacefully on the cot in the office. But he immediately opened his eyes when he heard extraneous sounds that disturbed his rest. The young man quickly got up from the pillow and sat on the bed. The guy was clearly irritated by what was happening. He turned to the one who had disturbed him. "What do you want?" Startled by the student's abrupt awakening, Louis began to apologize for disturbing him. Clark gave him various snacks to eat. After school, the kids from the first and second grades will drop by to say hello. "You are now the head of the school," the blonde explained. An irritated Charlie ordered him to get lost, and the bully apologized to him again. At that very moment, Clark ran out of the medical room so as not to disturb Ross once again. The young man sat on the bed for a while and thought about everything he had heard. A little later, he went out into the corridors of the school, where the students tried to avoid him, looking at him with fear. People glanced at him warily as the boy passed by, but Charlie paid no attention to anyone. Kate, standing near one of the classrooms, saw Ross walking. Shyly, tucking her hair behind her ear, she smiled sweetly and approached the guy. The student looked at her silently, incomprehensibly. Diaz handed him his bag and asked if he was okay. Putting his backpack on his back, Charlie coldly replied that she shouldn't worry. Nothing serious had happened. The young man had already turned away to go about his business. However, a female voice called out to him rudely, so he and Kate turned to see who it was. In the corridor stood the same 4 girls who were on the roof and looked in their direction with malicious glee. The blonde stepped forward and said, "They want to see you. Take a minute." Charlie frowned and snapped back that he was leaving. He invited Kate to come with him, and she quickly agreed with him. The blonde didn't like this attitude and she got angry. The girls shouted after those leaving down the corridor, "Hey!" Soon Diaz and Ross walked out into the schoolyard together. Suddenly Snow White said, "Cheryl, I think she took a photo of you, that girl who came up to us." She warned the young man to be careful, as the blonde was rumored to be sleeping with several guys. Charlie was a little confused, he thought. What is there to be afraid of? You would probably faint if you found out what European children are doing. At the exit from school, 4 serious, muscular men were waiting for the young man near a black car. One of them was looking at his phone, where there was a photo of Charlie, and comparing it with the young man passing by. He asked his comrade, who answered yes. Ross became wary. These big guys were clearly looking at him. "Hey, come here." They called the student to them. Was it really them that Darren was talking about when he suspected the school children were connected to gangsters? Kate began to worry and asked not to go to the men. The girl tried to detain the young man by grabbing him by the jacket, but the brunette carefully removed her trembling hand. "It's okay," Charlie tried to calm Snow White down, and after a few steps the student stood in front of 4 serious men. "Are you Charlie Ross?" asked one of them. The young man answered affirmatively and asked what they wanted. "The puppy," as they said, "has no respect at all." The man got angry at him. Charlie assessed the situation. 4 opponents, if that were the case, it wouldn't be that dangerous. The only thing that bothered him was that there was little room for a fight as he looked back at Kate and the rest of the students. The man continued, "Kid, we didn't come to fight, so fix your face." He pointed to the car behind him and ordered them to get in to discuss something important. "What?" Ross asked, cheekily and irritably. Diaz was standing not far from them. She was very worried about what was happening. Charlie, without looking away, looked at the man with anger in his eyes. He in turn grinned and laughed a little. Snow White looked at the tense situation and covered her mouth with her hands in fear. The thug with the cigarette put his hand on the student's head, saying, "What a fine boy." Not allowing himself to be treated this way, Ross ordered him to remove his hands. This angered the man. "You really are completely immature. I wanted to be more gentle." The boy looked at him irritably, peeking out from under his arm. The student threw away the big guy's hand that was lying on his head. With a quick movement, he grabbed the front of his clothes with his hand so that he couldn't dodge, and immediately he hit his forehead with all his might into his face. The cigarette flew out of his mouth, saliva and blood flowed. His whole face was distorted by the impact. The young man grabbed him by the collar and the wrist of his right hand and swung hard. He knocked over the huge man at the same moment, and he powerfully hit his head with the asphalt. The man's whole body was shaking. Foam was coming out of his mouth. The surrounding students were shouting, "They are fighting!" The guys immediately started taking out their phones and filming what was happening on cameras. One of the men rudely ordered them to put away their mobile phones. He walked up to one of the students and knocked the phone out of his hands. The phone quickly fell onto the asphalt and its screen was completely smashed. All the students immediately grabbed their phones tightly, shocked by such rudeness. "Little bastard," the bandit said, Taking a knife out of the inside pocket of his jacket, Charlie immediately began to take his briefcase off his shoulders so that nothing would hinder his movements. The leader immediately approached the guy with a knife and said sternly, "Did you decide to make sashimi before school?" He said that we just need to make sure that the puppy can't act up anymore. The man understood the boss and put away the knife. He and another thug prepared for battle. After this, two of the men stood on either side of Charlie. The student even smiled a little. The guys were in a good formation. They were clearly different from the older students. "Quickly wipe that grin off your face, bastard," one of them ordered and swung at the student. Charlie, in turn, aimed his fist to strike. And at the moment when the man tried to hit him, the student dodged and punched him in the jaw. After that, he immediately began to deliver a merciless series of blows. Everything happened so quickly that almost no movement was visible. And at this time, the second big guy decided to take advantage of the moment and attack the brunette from behind. Ross noticed out of the corner of his eye a large figure approaching him. Although he couldn't dodge, the guy successfully blocked it with his hand. And with the next movement, he turned around and struck a hard blow to the stomach so that the big man bent in half. The one who had been hit many times was terribly angry. And when he more or less came to his senses, he bared his teeth and began to aim at the student. The man believed that since Charlie had his back to him, he would be able to inflict serious damage on him. But his calculated attack was stopped by a fist to the jaw from Ross, who naturally sensed the enemy's movements. Instantly, a fist from the second bandit flew at the brunette from the other side. Thanks to his agility, he was able to bend down so that the man missed. The young man quickly looked back at his attacker with an enraged gaze, and suddenly he decided to kick him in the head, but the big guy somehow managed to block it, almost falling over from surprise. Charlie stood up on both feet and continued to deliver punches one after another to his opponent's body while there was another opponent behind him. Trying to cover himself with his hands, the man realized that the guy had gotten carried away and was trying with all his might to resist him. As expected, it's a completely different fight with adults. "I'll have to prepare this body better," Charlie thought. The head of the four suddenly smiled, looking at what was happening. Ross noticed that strange grin and knew something was wrong. Not having time to react in time, the student was hit. The leader kicked him in the back so hard that the blow was reflected in his chest. It was mean, but Charlie stayed on his feet, but he was very angry. If Darren sees this, he'll be making fun of him for a long time. At this point, the leader started talking. "We've seen your abilities, so how about you call it a day and come with us?" "I told you we didn't come here to fight. It's your business, not mine. It just ruined my mood at the end of the day," Charlie answered him. Apparently, there was nothing left, so the leader began to take his hands out of his pockets. He decided to teach Ross a lesson and make him come with us, so he immediately hit him with his right hand. Although the young man managed to block it, he still felt pain from this powerful blow. At that moment, he decided to grab his hand, which was just near his shoulder. And with quick and precise movements, he began to move forward, turning the man's hand at the same time. Hellish pain was reflected on the leader's face. His hand twisted around itself with a crunching sound. Ross immediately hit the bandit in the face with his elbow. Two bandits immediately rushed to the boss's defense, shouting, "What a bastard, you brought all this trouble on yourself." Having let go of the leader, the student turned to face the approaching enemies again. Suddenly, all the participants in the fight froze when they heard a female voice. "Is this the police?" Kate Diaz, standing nearby, was talking on the phone and said, "There's a fight here." She looked around cautiously and continued, "Address?" The leader was unhappy with this outcome of events. It irritated him greatly. Holding his wounded hand, he turned to the young man. "We'll finish today, but I'll remember this. Next time I'll break her completely." The student responded with a threat. In a short period of time, the bandits gathered, got into their car and drove away. Snow White sighed with relief and said that it was time for her and the young man to go too. Charlie was worried that after her call, the girl might have problems with the police. However, it turned out that the police would not come, as she simply pretended to call. "Well, apparently you believed it too." Kate smiled awkwardly. The student looked at her and thought, did she do this because she was smart or because she was stupid? Charlie noticed Cheryl standing a few meters away from him and looking in his direction. The young man decided to approach her. The blonde was irritated and tension was visible on her face. When Ross approached her, he immediately said rudely, "I'll give you one piece of advice. Live on your own. If you continue to live at someone else's expense, you'll end up getting screwed." "Who are you to tell me this?" The girl pushed the student in the chest in anger. They both looked at each other, and there was anger in their eyes. Charlie decided not to continue the conflict, so he quickly turned around and walked away, saying goodbye to her. Cheryl's impudence made her shout across the street after him, "Hey, Charlie!" But the guy ignored her. Soon the young man and Kate were walking down the street. The guy's thoughts were occupied with the battle that had taken place. The blows were not so strong as to cause serious injuries, but I still managed to get them. No matter how you look at it, this body is too weak. Diaz was concerned about her friend's condition and asked if she needed to call an ambulance, but Ross refused and suggested they go get something to eat. Charlie asked, "Do you like chops?" Snow White was a little confused at first by the unexpected question, but then she smiled sweetly and said that she liked chops. The next day, the teacher explained to the class, so Sonaxol, for defending this theory, Sun Tzu could be considered a cold-blooded and inhumane person. But this is far from the truth. We can simply observe differences in the perception of the world, since Sun Tzu, being one of the followers of Confucius, he always put virtue and ethics first, so listening to these words, the exhausted Charlie tried his best not to fall asleep. Soon his desk mate said that the lesson was over. The young man immediately lay down on the desk. It would have been better for him to run around the battlefield with machine guns at the ready. Then, unexpectedly, students approached them from behind. Ross raised his head from his desk, looking in their direction, and asked what they needed. One of them said, pointing to the guys standing nearby, "These are second graders and these are first graders." After that, he handed the young man an envelope with the words that inside was money for this week. The brunette didn't like this, so he irritably asked who asked them to give him money. The student turned to where Louis usually sat, but he was not there. Charlie looked sternly at the crowd of boys. "Give it back and don't do it again, and stop walking around here in a herd, waving the envelope away," the guy ordered the guys. Charlie was very sleepy and lay down on his desk again, kicking the boys out of the classroom, who obediently bowed and left. However, immediately after this, another student wearing glasses approached Charlie's desk. Annoyed that he couldn't be left alone, Charlie raised his head again and asked, "Do you have something to say too?" The guy in glasses reported that the student's physical education teacher had called him to the teacher's room. Charlie's expression immediately changed. He was interested in why Darren was calling him. Sitting in the teacher's lounge, Darren asked, "I heard something here. Did you get into a fight with someone yesterday too?" "And gossip spreads quickly here, but nothing serious," the student said. Darren cautiously asked the commander to stop fighting, because he was not a child. "Others may not know, but I don't need to tell you. Who was the one who was picking on everyone the most in Africa?" Ross asked. The man raised his voice, trying to convey to the young man that this was Korea, not Africa. That there were surveillance cameras, black boxes, telephones, police that arrived in 5 minutes at every step. He insistently said, "You don't want to get kicked out of school," but for Darren it was even better, since he could immediately return to Africa. Darren cooled down a bit. He didn't like all this, but in any case, whether the commander would go or not, he had a request. The student listened to his friend with interest. "There are 4 kids at school who are being bullied. Things are really bad. Could you please sort this out?" Darren asked. However, Charlie explained that these students would be worse off if he went away, so they had to think of something else. The teacher suggested that I be excused from classes. How? Charlie did not understand his interlocutor. Darren explained that except for physical education, they have to attend classes until lunch. And after lunch, they sleep anyway. The teachers don't even say anything. Moreover, you need to do sports. If you go to Africa in this condition, you will last a maximum of 1 week, the man explained. His words made Charlie think. 4, you say? The student asked the teacher. He, in turn, nodded affirmatively. After their conversation, the brunette walked down the school corridor. The young man noticed Cheryl standing nearby wearing a mask. She turned to him, asking him to spare her a minute. But the student deliberately ignored her and walked past. The guy walked into the classroom and the blonde got really angry. Unable to bear the insult, she shouted, "Hey, you bastard! This is all because of you and you just decided to ignore it." The guy turned towards her with displeasure and asked, "What?" Tears appeared in the girl's eyes. She began to tremble a little and said, "Yesterday? Those guys." Charlie saw the state Cheryl was in. He interrupted her speech as he realized that this conversation was not for prying ears, commanding her to follow him. Kate, who had been in the office the whole time, saw this scene and closely watched the leaving students. The 2 of them went out onto the roof, and the blonde shared that yesterday those guys asked her to bring the young man. They said that if she didn't bring Charlie, they would cut out Lewis's tongue and throw him out on the island, and they would sell her to a brothel. Ross suggested that she report them to the police. "If I do this, they will get to our parents. If you come with me, I will do whatever you ask," Cheryl said. The young man turned to her with interest. "Is it all true?" The girl clenched her fist to her chest. She was ready for anything, even right now. Ross began to slowly approach the blonde, who stood with her eyes closed, clutching her skirt in her hand in fear. Cheryl started to shake as Charlie brought his hand towards her. Right, in the end, you're the same as those bastards, she thought. But the young man only wiped away her tears and smeared mascara. She looks terrible. When we go down, go wash your face and don't put on makeup anymore. And the form has stretched, he continued. Not expecting this from Charlie, Cheryl asked him again in confusion. The student explained that she said she would do everything. The blonde still couldn't believe that this was all he wanted. Charlie asked me to call that asshole. At this moment, she felt a little embarrassed. Even though she had his contact, she couldn't call him first. But Charlie still told her to call. She looked at him worriedly. But she had no choice. So the girl reached into her jacket pocket. She took out her phone and started looking for the right contact. And soon, that same bastard's phone rang with a call from Cheryl. He grinned and said, "Our Cheryl has grown up. She is already the first to call." Charlie immediately snatched the phone from the blonde's hands. The young man brought the phone to his ear and immediately said that it was him. The man asked, "Did she explain everything to you?" "She should have told you to come right away." He is immediately interrupted by Ross, who explains that he will be busy until the weekend, so he will come on Monday. On the other end of the line, a voice began to speak irritably. "What? You still don't understand what situation you're in." The young man again insisted that he would come on Monday, and if he didn't like it, he would hang up. The man was irritated by this behavior. He looked back at the people sitting behind him who had approved of Monday's meeting, after which he returned to the conversation and agreed to the guy's condition. The man explained that an order had come from above, so he was allowing it this time, but if the boy ran away again, Charlie interrupted him again and assured him that this would not happen, so stop torturing children who had nothing to do with it. Their conversation ended, and the student returned the phone back to Cheryl. The young man began to leave when suddenly the girl began to ask him for her number. She started saying that if he suddenly needed something from her. Charlie smiled. He remembered his friend Steven. If he were alive, they would have made a perfect couple. The guy told the girl not to worry, warning that they would meet after school on Monday. Ross left the roof after these words. The girl was left alone with her thoughts at a loss. A little later, it was time for the end of classes, and the student was going home. His mind was racing. France, bodywork, the four scumbags, Cheryl, the bullies. It had only been a short time since I woke up. Why was everything so confusing? Suddenly, Kate runs up to the guy, calling him. Now Snow White, whom he remembered, joins his thoughts. Diaz suggested going together and Charlie agreed. The boys walked together for a long time and didn't talk about anything. At some point, the girl decided to ask Charlie. She looked at the young man a little shyly and said, "Are you by any chance in love with Cheryl?" The brunette looked at his friend with incomprehension. Kate looked down in embarrassment. She reminded him that Cheryl and Charlie had recently been together. "No wonder I'm not as beautiful as she is," Snow White said sadly. "What the hell is she talking about?" The guy was completely confused. Charlie calmly explained that they had nothing in common, so Kate got the wrong idea that Ross was simply talking to her about the fight from yesterday. Inspired, Diaz immediately asked joyfully, "So you don't like her?" The young man looked at his friend with suspicion. He considered these things useless, and Snow White breathed a sigh of relief. Then Ross finally got an idea and decided to ask the girl directly. "Are you in love with me?" the student asked her, his eyes wide with excitement. Kate was a little frightened and blushed from such pressure and directness. She closed her eyes shyly and began to smile. The girl immediately covered her face with her hands and turned away from the confused young man. At that moment, the guy was thinking about only one thing. "I'm 29. The boys walked together to the park and sat on one of the benches. Charlie looked at his friend cautiously. She, in turn, held her hands to her face in embarrassment, her cheeks still red from embarrassment. An unexpected question from Snow White surprised the student a little. "Are we supposed to kiss now?" she said tenderly. "What, don't you want to?" The young man tried to move away from his persistent girlfriend, citing the fact that they were still school children. Kate's eyes looked sad and she seemed about to cry. The girl immediately moved away and lowered her head, because all the other guys were already kissing. Charlie did not expect this. Ross knew he had to get out of this place first and said, "I'll kiss you if you become the best in school." Diaz was immediately happy, because she is the best right now, so she will also be first in the next ranking. The girl jumped off the bench with joy. Charlie tensed up. As if in an instant Snow White had increased in size, she screamed, "You will be obliged to kiss me." Ross was horrified. What was going on? In front of the guy stood a huge girlfriend who was the size of a house. She had a terrifying aura, as if Kate was bewitching. "Kiss!" She stamped her foot, causing the ground to shake, and the young man almost fell. The boy realized that it was time to run and rushed away from the giantess, who shook the surface with every step. Her eyes were burning, her face had lost its outline. The nightmarish girl was stretching out her hand with the words, "Kiss." Ross was in a panic. Veins began to appear on his forehead from the tension. He was screaming frantically. With these same cries, the young man woke up and jumped out of bed, preparing his fists for battle. Cold sweat poured down the student's body like a river, and he was breathing heavily. This nightmare turned out to be just a dream. Charlie sighed with relief. Soon he got ready for school and left the room ready to study. His mother noticed him. She was sitting in the living room reading a book. The son warned Sophia that he was leaving. She asked where he was going. To school, of course, the young man answered her. Sophia wondered why he needed to go to school on Saturday. Mom started to worry that his headache had not yet cleared up, but her son quickly got out of it by saying that he was in 3rd grade. That's why he has extra classes. Charlie started to walk away and the woman wished him good luck. Out on the street, Ross thought, people don't go to school on Saturdays now? And the world has become a better place. Darren called the young man on the phone. "Where are you?" Charlie asked him nervously, shouting into the phone. Soon the student was riding in the car with the teacher. Darren worried that the extra lessons were not too lame an excuse. The guy sighed. But what else could he come up with to justify himself to his mother? The man suggested going to the mountains where there was clean water, and they could eat chicken. After a while, they finally reached their destinations and the comrades were looking forward to rest. Sitting at the table, Darren was drinking beer. Charlie wondered if his friend would drink alone, since he wanted to too. The man smiled and said, "I put on a school uniform, but I didn't get any beer." Ross sternly reminded him that his friend was about to get behind the wheel, so he shouldn't get drunk. The teacher pointed at the captain and said that he had an assistant. The brute. He had become a complete Korean, said a dissatisfied Charlie. Darren grinned. "I've lived here long enough, unlike some people." The guy looked at him and exhaled with a smile on his face. He decided to ask him, "Do you like it? Your current life? Are you happy?" The man thought for a moment and fell silent. But soon he scratched his nose and said that it is what it is. Darren began to share that at first he felt like he was going crazy living in someone else's body. That night he screamed terribly and grabbed his head, and his wife and daughter ran to him in horror. They hugged him to calm him down. The girls were crying, afraid for him. His hands were shaking. Sweat was pouring down his body. His wife was trying to calm him down, holding his hand. But that day he also found a wife and daughter. The daughter held onto the other hand, also crying out of fear for her father's condition. Darren was in a state of shock at the time. It was hard. Now he cares what will happen to the people he leaves behind. And he doesn't even think he'll be able to return to Africa with this body. Charlie tensed up and listened carefully to his friend. Darren shared that in any case, the thought that the universe has gone crazy and given him a chance to live differently does not leave him. Ross smiled and agreed with him. It really was nice here. The young man looked around. It was so peaceful here that he felt uneasy. "And you say this, who almost started a stabbing at school in 2 days?" Darren remarked sarcastically. The comrades laughed long and loudly together. At some point, Charlie exhaled and looked sternly at his interlocutor. He shared that he was going to meet with those scumbags on Monday. Darren was shocked by this news. He wanted to know where exactly. The young man said that he didn't need to know this, but Darren was surprised by this answer. "Isn't this too much in our relationship?" Ross noted that in their relationship, if a guy tells him a place, he will immediately come running, so it's impossible. Darren got angry. "I already told you, Commander, your body is now the body of a simple high school student. You can't act like the old way." "I will do it my way, so don't interfere. This is an order," the young man insisted. Since the captain gave the order, Darren could not say anything against it. They continued their meal, fried chicken in a pan, and rested. Suddenly, the man tore the commander away from his food and addressed him. "How many do you think you killed?" he asked the surprised guy. Darren was curious. If we take it roughly, then Charlie killed about several hundred. The young man did not understand why he was asking such a thing. Why did he need to know this? Darren asked not to go there. You just need to close your eyes to it a couple of times, and the commander will be able to live peacefully in this world. Charlie listened to him carefully and understood his friend's concern. Ross thanked him for these words. However, he reminded himself of his character, which Darren knew very well. "When we sort all this out, let's come back here again," Charlie suggested, and the man agreed. As night fell, they returned back. Darren gave the guy a ride home. The young man went home and locked himself in his room, remaining in the dark. Ross closed his eyes and imagined a crowd of bandits with different weapons around him. He prepared for battle and took a fighting stance. At the same moment, the guys who had surrounded him from all sides attacked him, some with bats, some with knives. Charlie punched the first two in the jaws, drawing blood immediately. While he was dealing with them, there were still people on the other side. The next man to run up to him was already swinging his arm to hit him. However, Charlie was faster than him and grabbed his wrist, which held the knife. The young man recalled some techniques, one of them. Pull towards yourself and hit in the jaw. Suddenly, the guy's face distorted with pain. The young man clenched his teeth. One man snuck up on him from behind with a knife and plunged the blade into him. Immediately, other guys started stabbing the guy from all sides, showing no mercy. Hellish, excruciating pain pierced his entire body. Blood gushed out like a stream and Charlie screamed. He fell to his knees in his room. Opening his eyes, the young man was breathing heavily, sweat pouring down his face. There were imaginary enemies all around. The student tried to catch his breath. This won't do, he thought. The body can't keep up with thoughts, it's too weak and slow. Ross thought hard. Would he be able to do it in this state? Suddenly, his mother's voice disturbed him from behind the door, asking if he was asleep. At that very second, the student ran to put his t-shirt on. He quickly replied that she could come through, so Sophia opened the door. The light in the room was on, and her son was looking at her calmly and smiling, sitting on a chair. The guy asked, "Are you still awake?" Mom replied that she was going to bed soon. She sat on the edge of his bed and asked if Charlie was busy tomorrow. "Remember my friend Sun-hee? She invited me to brunch at a restaurant run by a French guy. Her son will be there, so I thought you should go too," Sophia continued. "Right tomorrow," Charlie thought to himself. Mom immediately said that if he was busy, then it was okay. Yet her eyes betrayed her sadness no matter what she said. Charlie said that he would go with her, since there was nothing else to do anyway. Sophia looked at her son with inspiration. Could this really be true? The next day, at the appointed time, they approached the restaurant. Charlie was angry with himself. It was just great to eat when you don't have enough time to train. The young man looked at the sign. Martin Levasseur, in Korean, would be something like Masanchip or Jeonju restaurant. Mom tensed up a little, but her gaze looked purposeful. She turned to her son and said sternly, "Let's go." They entered a beautiful and spacious restaurant together. Sophia turned her head, looking for her friend. Then from the next table came a voice. "We are here." The woman in glasses waved amiably, and her son sat next to her. Sophia also waved her hand in greeting. But something else caught Charlie's eye. There were girls sitting nearby, discussing in French how handsome Charlie was. Ross didn't show that he understood them, but he grinned a little, after which he immediately turned towards Sun-hee and said hello. The mother and son greeted their friends in French. What kind of idiotic pronunciation is this? The young man was outraged in his thoughts when he heard them. Suddenly, Sun-hee's son began to smile in a nasty way, looking at Charlie. At that same moment, his mother, biting her lip, looked at Sophia. The young man exhaled. It became clear to him what was happening here. Everyone sat down at the table and Sun-hee began to tell, "Lately our Daeshik has been going to extra classes which are not so easy to get into. I can give you one place so that you can send Charlie there." Sophia agreed, but said she could later. The woman with glasses asked about Charlie's grades in English, but it turned out that they were not very high. "What do you mean short? Where are you looking?" The woman said discontentedly. "If he does not study a foreign language, then you can forget about top universities. I feel so sorry for you." Ross looked at his mother, who at that moment looked down in embarrassment. At this time, a waiter passed by their table and Daeshik called out to him in French. The guy asked to bring another glass of water. Soon the glass was filled upon request. Sun-hee continued bragging. "Our son goes to a school with advanced foreign language studies, so he already speaks French fluently. Do you know why I invited you to this restaurant?" Seeing how hard his mother tries, the child will also strive for the top. "Our son also speaks a little French," Sophia answered her modestly. The woman's eyes lit up and she began to bombard her with questions. "Does he go to some training center in the Daechi, Cheongdam area? Or does he take private lessons?" Sophia quietly and a little awkwardly explained that her son was studying independently on the internet. "What?" Sun-hee asked with contempt and mockery. She and Daeshik immediately began to laugh completely tactlessly at what they heard. The two of them began to mock and humiliate Sophia, saying that she was funny and that her son was apparently a genius. Charlie's mother was completely overcome with shame, especially when Sun-hee pointed out that it must be too expensive for their family if Charlie decided to do it himself. At this point, Ross couldn't take it anymore and said sternly in French, "Hey, behave normally." The girls who were talking about him, Sun-hee, Daeshik, and Mom, were surprised and looked at him with wide eyes. The girls, blushing with shame, asked, "Did you understand everything we just said?" I didn't want to eavesdrop, but the conversation here was so boring that I accidentally overheard it. The student answered them. He stated that he had no desire to meet any of them, so he asked them not to talk nonsense. However, he immediately reassured them, "Don't worry, This idiot only knows greetings, and these ladies don't speak French at all. Sonia was embarrassed, and her son said nervously he seemed to greet them. Sophia also decided to brag. Our son learned French on the internet. Apparently he is a genius, you know. Recently we got a call from France, and the red-haired girl at the next table remarked, "Internet? Then you should talk very little." Charlie was pleasantly surprised that she understood Korean, so he asked, "You will help us a lot if you come over and talk. I will owe you." The girl was very interested in this proposal, so the three of them got up from their table and walked over to Charlie. When the mother asked her son what had happened, he explained to her that the girls said they were interested in talking to me, so they came up to meet me. The young man introduced the girls. The redhead was Michelle, with bangs and long hair was Cecile, with a bob cut was Cindy. Sophia immediately asked him to tell them that she was very pleased to meet them. At this time, Sonhee began to leave the table. The woman began to adjust her glasses and awkwardly make excuses. "Yes, I must have gone crazy. Our Deshik has extra credit today. I completely forgot." She and her son began to leave the restaurant in a hurry, and Sophia only managed to tell them to be careful. "I think that's enough." "Thank you. You can go," Charlie said. But Michelle didn't like the wording, "you can go." Ross didn't understand what the girl meant. She smiled and reminded him of his debt. It turned out that Michelle wanted to get his number. She explained, "No one will understand what we're talking about anyway. To be honest, you interested me." At that moment, the young man even became a little confused. "You're funny," Charlie decided to answer. Michelle started to come closer and put her hand on the table, saying, "Does it look like I'm joking?" The girl coquettishly sat on the edge of the table and began to play with her hair, flirting with the young man. "Just don't tell me that you are one of those terrible men who cannot keep their word." Ross clearly liked this behavior. The girl was no slouch. A while later, Monday came and Charlie was working hard in the gym, doing push-ups and handstands. Suddenly, the young man remembered Michelle's words. "Just don't tell me that you are one of those terrible men who cannot keep their word." And he laughed. "What made you laugh so much in that situation?" This question brought Charlie back to real life. Darren looked sternly at the guy. Ross came out of the handstand but said it was nothing special. "It seems like it's serious. I can't lift my arms after a couple of warm-up exercises," Charlie worried. Then Darren suggested contacting the police before it's too late. The student smiled and turned to the wall, which angered the teacher, because now was not the time to smile. He shouted, "If something goes wrong, you will go to France on crutches." While the young man was warming up, he suggested an idea. "Let's open a sports club when we finish this. Then, even if I leave during the holidays, they can handle everything together. Isn't that a great idea?" Darren agreed. It would be even easier to get the budget for buying sports equipment, and I could be the manager. But immediately after that, he shouted again, "But that's not important now, Commander. You're still weak, and those bastards aren't so simple." Here, Charlie decided to pronounce the motto of the Foreign Legion, which is a special unit of the French army where men of any nationality and from any country can be recruited. Legio Patria Nostra. In an instant, Darren straightened up and clearly said, "The Legion is our homeland." Ross started getting dressed and asked, "What is the continuation of the motto?" Darren shouted, "There is no word for us. Retreat." Charlie explained, "Cheryl and Lewis may be complete scum, but I promised I would go. I would rather go and get stabbed than back down." Darren was silent at first, looking into his eyes. But he couldn't resist and attacked the commander. "I really like my wife now, so don't turn me into a gym teacher who will go to prison because he didn't save you from a knife." The young man wiped the sweat from his body after training. He understood his comrade. And when he was fully dressed, he set off on his way. Darren wanted to go together, but Charlie refused. The student turned around and asked if his friend remembered Mangala. He exhaled and turned away. "Are you talking about this again?" Soon the boy came out of the extension and walked past the school. As he walked out of the gate, a black car stopped in front of him. The man with the scar on his lip asked, "Charlie Ross?" The young man nodded and got into the car. After some time, they finally arrived at the right place. Charlie walked under the surveillance of two bandits. They walked along the corridor. The young man carefully noticed and remembered the situation around him, that there were 6 rooms on the left, 5 on the right. The student was brought to room number 3, where 5 bandits were sitting at a laid table. The guy looked around the room tensely. The one sitting in the middle ordered him to sit down so as not to look down on his elders. Charlie sat down on the sofa, looking around warily. The head smiled and noted, "The look is good." He started pouring something into his glass and explained, "You talked a lot about how we should hush this matter up quietly and without unnecessary problems. But I think differently. You have to be brave enough to do such things," he said, drinking the contents of the glass. The bandit continued, "I am not your commander to force you to drink. The conversation will be short, so will you quietly join our family?" or will you regret it all your life?" These words made Charlie smile. This reaction made the man very angry. Ross responded sharply that he too would be brief in his speeches. He said menacingly, "Get your hands off our school. I don't care what you do here among yourselves, but stop bullying little children who don't understand anything." These words made the bodies of his subordinates tremble with rage. Out of anger, the chief squeezed the glass until it cracked, saying, "I thought you were a brave guy, but it turns out you're just a regular psycho. It's even kind of a shame." The young man squeezed the chopsticks lying on the table in his hand and repeated that they should not even breathe in the direction of the school that such a psychopath goes to. One of the bandits couldn't take it anymore and attacked the student. His fist flew past the boy's face, but he dodged it. Charlie quickly thrust the sticks into his hand, driving them into the table. The man screamed in pain and his face twisted. The leader ordered everyone else to finish him off. 3 huge men attacked the young man. He attacked the first one in the jaw and punched the second one in the stomach, so that he started spitting blood. The third one first got hit in the jaw from below, and then Ross decided to add to it and hit him in the cheek. Soon, all the bandits who had attacked him were lying around the room. Now the young man's gaze fell on the head, who remained conscious. How angry this man was. He was ready to kill this little bastard. At the same second, he pounces on him across the table. However, his fist flies past. Charlie managed to dodge. Now the leader was in a vulnerable position because he was exposed. Charlie made a headlock and began to choke him. Ross kicks the door out of the room with one foot. The young man is extremely tense, but he has no intention of giving up. Charlie walked out into the hallway, still holding the bandit, but he was surrounded by a crowd of guns. The man he grabbed grinned cheekily and said that the guy was finished. Ross shouted, "If you don't want to see your brother die, disperse." One of the men went on the attack anyway, swinging a bat. The student noticed his movements out of the corner of his eye, and at that very moment, without letting go of the bandit's head, he kicked the attacker, causing him to fly away. A commotion began. The bandit flew into the people standing nearby. The rest moved into battle, ready to kill the guy. The battle began. A bunch of big guys started beating Charlie, but the young man tried to dodge. Because he lacked strength, the bandit was able to escape from his grip. As soon as he got to his feet, he ordered, "Just kill this bastard." Instantly, a powerful blow lands on his impudent mug. Then Ross kicked him in the chest with all his might, and the man knocked down several others with his body. This action gave the young man a chance to escape, and he ran. He didn't care where to step, so the guy pushed off the face of that same bandit. In an instant, the student found himself jumping over the heads of his enemies. And in order not to go down, the brunette again pushed off the head, but this time of another bandit. He jumped away from him onto the wall, from where he pushed off again. Charlie flew swiftly over the heads of his disgruntled opponents. And when the student had overcome the entire crowd, he jumped to the floor. But he was immediately knocked off his feet by a man standing nearby. And again, this whole crowd turned around and went to attack him. The blows came raining down. So many of them and so fast that they were almost impossible to track. They were overwhelming him with numbers. Charlie terribly regretted that he was not in his own body now. However, there was nothing to be done, so the young man clenched his fist and began to resist the blows. There was also confusion in the crowd because everyone wanted to kill the bastard, but there were so many people that they started pushing. After a while, those who stood first were lying on the floor covered in blood. The guys who were standing nearby were still holding on, but it was obvious that they were badly wounded. Charlie stood in a fighting stance, ready to fight again. However, suddenly an order was heard from the crowd. "Hey, disperse!" The bandits dispersed and 2 men came forward. The one with the tail was indignant about why it was so difficult for them to cope with the child. "Forget about a painless death. I'll cut you into pieces with a saw and feed you to the dogs," he said to Charlie. Ross noticed that the 2 had the eyes of experienced killers. They pulled out their weapons and prepared to destroy the boy. But at the other end of the crowd there was a sound, and everyone turned in that direction. The bandit immediately attacked the stranger, but the man in the mask easily parried his blow with his bat. The bandits didn't expect this, so they became very tense. Charlie didn't understand what was happening either. The man in the mask looked menacing. His eyes seemed to glow. 2 more decided to attack him with bats in their hands. After a few swings of his weapon, the masked guy destroyed these daredevils. Ross watched their fight closely. He saw him standing over the bloody body he had so quickly dealt with. It was then that the young man realized who the man in the mask was and grinned, "I told you not to come?" The bandit with the tail was confused as to why the other man was beating their comrades. The second one told him that it didn't matter now. They would just deal with the 2. "As you can see, we have more work." The guy with long hair turned around, smiling. So he decided to deal with it quickly and immediately attacked the student. The brunette tried to dodge the enemy's numerous quick blows. Unfortunately, He missed one and ended up with a deep cut on his thigh. The young man felt a terrible pain piercing his body. The second bandit with the scar called out to the distracted guy as he approached him from the other side. He cut his shoulder with his blade, and the student didn't have time to react. Ross was moving too slowly for the bandit's liking, so he pierced his body with his weapon again and again. Charlie's shirt began to turn scarlet. The young man tried to somehow block the blows of the professional killers. Charlie moved away from the attackers a little, trying to stop the bleeding from his shoulder. The scarred man quickly rushed towards him to deliver the final killing blow. Darren, who was fighting with the rest of the bandits, sensed danger, and now the blade was flying straight towards the wounded student. Charlie closed his eyes, memories of sitting at a military gathering before a battle flooding into his mind. How Darren constantly distracted him with requests to translate what the general was saying. How they set out on a mission where many enemies were waiting for them. As explosions thundered around, bullets flew. Then Stephen, who was dying, told them to leave. Charlie shouted at his friend, "Who am I? Who am I?" He repeated again to the wounded Stephen. He smiled through the pain and said, "That the captain is the god of Blackfield." Opening my eyes, the tip of the blade was already almost at my eye. But Charlie stopped him through the pain, grabbing the blade with his bare hand. His hand was covered in blood. The scarred man was shocked by such an act. However, the bandit immediately swung his other hand with a blade at him. This time, the Russian successfully grabbed his wrist. The bandit did not understand where such a goldfinch got such strength from. Charlie said menacingly, his eyes blazing, "The god of Blackfield is a name given to me by my enemies." The young man looked at the enemy with a murderous gaze and shouted, "Die!" Still holding the knife and wrist, the student slammed his head into his with all his might. The man's face with the scar seemed to be pressed into his skull. Charlie let go of the knife and clenched his bloody hand into a fist. With the next blow, he again broke the opponent's skull. The bandit fell unconscious, and the brunette moved on to another one with long hair. Fear appeared on the man's face. He did not expect such a turn of events. Ross aimed his powerful blow straight at him. A moment later, the opponent's cheek was dented by the student's force, and blood began to splash in all directions. The man fell unconscious, his body sliding down the wall. But this was apparently not enough for the young man, so he approached the bandit. His eyes burned with cruelty as he raised his fist to deliver the finishing blow. Darren shouted that you can't kill, and in an instant, Charlie's fist stopped a few centimeters from the bandit's neck. With a look that longed for death, the young man looked at his comrade. They both looked at each other, and yet the guy did not kill the man and walked away from him. The bandits who were fighting with Darren stopped in confusion. Darren, wearing a mask, watched the student closely and exhaled. "Those who do not want to continue the fight, go to the other room," the young man commanded. The bandits looked at each other silently, deciding what to do next. Eventually, they decided to retreat into the room, leaving the fight behind. The door slammed shut, and there was no one left in the corridor. With difficulty, Charlie reached the wall and leaned against it. The young man slid down it, experiencing hellish pain. "Damn you, I thought I'd never see you again," Darren cursed, and Charlie grinned and asked where he'd dug up such a mask. "Actually, this is a pretty popular monkey," the man said in his defense, and suggested leaving. But the commander noted that if they left in such a state, someone would definitely call the police. Darren asked the young man to stay here while he looked for something to cover himself with. So the guy was left alone sitting in the corridor. He decided to have a smoke while he waited and reached into his pocket. Unfortunately, at that very moment the cigarette box was empty. At that moment his gaze focused and the young man tensed. He heard the sounds of footsteps. The guy counted at least 20 people. Were these reinforcements? A crowd of men came out into the corridor towards him. Ross found it hard to get up, afraid that his body would not withstand another battle. The crowd stopped and a man emerged from it, apparently the leader. He turned to the student. "I couldn't believe it, but are you really a schoolboy?" The chief ordered one of his subordinates to go and check everything inside. He continued, "My name is Lee Guantek. Everyone knows me as Guantek from the Shinsa area. I came as soon as I heard that someone was throwing guys from the juke gang left and right." Charlie immediately asked, "Do you have cigarettes?" One of the bandits could not stand such rudeness and shouted, "Oh, you dandy!" Guantek immediately turned to the man and shouted, "Who is this brazenly interfering? Could you have handled this alone? I really want to talk about age. Go to a nursing home, you stupid idiot." Suddenly, a cry came from the crowd behind. "Go away, puppies." Darren began to quickly push his way through the crowd of men towards Charlie. He was worried about the commander, so he came right away. The leader laughed, looking at the senior and the monkey mask. "It looked too funny," he said. "Park Keebum should be ashamed." At that moment, his subordinate arrived and told him about the situation. There were no corpses. About 5 were in serious condition, and Jucha's gang was finished. Lee Guangtak commanded, "I will go first, so don't forget to clean up here and then come." Charlie and Darren knew that this man wanted to deal with all this quietly too. The chief said that they had a hospital where he usually sent his guys, so he suggested going there. Ross looked at the bandit with distrust, but there was no other choice, so he agreed. Soon night fell, and Charlie was taken to the necessary hospital. The young man was lying in a ward with an IV drip and a cast. After some time, he slowly began to open his eyes. Darren, who was next to him, was glad that the captain had woken up. The man said that the young man's wounds were too deep, and if they had been a little deeper, they would have had to use a sewing machine. The young man did not understand what his friend was talking about. Darren explained that when they got into the car to Lee Guantek, Charlie immediately passed out. At that moment, the guy began to remember how he led the head of the gang into the corridor where there were many bandits. How desperately I fought with these men. He also remembered those professional killers who had badly wounded him, and how the student dealt with them later. Charlie sat on his bed feeling ashamed of what had happened. The man said that the commander had been unconscious for quite a long time, and it was already 1 o'clock in the morning. "I should call you at home and tell you that you are staying overnight at my place," the teacher suggested. Charlie was in great pain from his injuries, refused food and asked for a cigarette. Guantak, who entered the room, intervened in their conversation. Ross, as soon as he saw him, asked about cigarettes, but the bandit replied, "What a puppy, looking for a smoke at every opportunity?" The head asked whether the man sitting next to him was the boy's teacher, and the student decided not to explain for long and agreed. Guantak looked at Darren suspiciously. Charlie assured him that he could be trusted, and so asked him to say what the man wanted. He exhaled and shook his head in agreement. "Thanks to you, I didn't even have to get my hands dirty, and now there's no one in Gangnam who could go against me," Lee Guantek said. So the man wanted to know if the student had any wishes for him. Ross only asked not to interfere with the school. The head accepted his wish. "I like you, so I'll give you some advice. Take care of your body for a while," Guantak continued. He warned him, "Gossip spreads quickly. Those who need you, those who hate you, those who are interested in you, people of all sorts will start to gather around you." To this, Charlie replied that he would figure it out himself and asked Guantak to mind his own business. The man was angry at such rudeness directed at him. "Hey Charlie, I admit you're a very capable guy," he said. The enraged man continued, "Whether you did it intentionally or not, I got a lot from you." Ross guessed that there was a but in his speech and asked about it. "I recognize your talent, so you must respect my name and authority," the bandit replied. However, after the question of what would happen if the student did not recognize his authority, the head finally lost his temper. Charlie was tense, but he wasn't about to bend over backwards for Guantak. After a tense silence, the bandit chuckled. "Okay, I lost. Let's forget everything and be friends," the man suggested. After these words, Darren decided to intervene and asked that they first remove those guys at the door because there was no need for it. Guantak asked what subject the teacher taught, and he said it was physical education. The chief understood that Darren was from Ulsan from his dialect, so he said, "And why did I think so? But I will leave the guys outside. The guys from Ulsan might arouse suspicion." Guantak warned them that he was leaving, so if they wanted something to eat, they should ask his guys. After that, he said goodbye and left the room. Ross asked his friend to go too, but he insisted that he would spend the night there and go to work in the morning. Darren asked, "By the way, is something going on with you and Kate?" She had been writing non-stop all this time, like crazy. Charlie replied that the girl was still too young, so it was not worth paying attention to. The student was wondering when he would be discharged, and it turned out that the doctor said in a month. Charlie thought about it, because then he would have to lie here for a week, and he couldn't say for the whole week that he was spending the night at the teacher's. So I suggested saying that they had an accident, had a short career counseling session, had dinner, and crashed on the way back, and to blame one of those on the outside. As he left the room, Darren said that in that case he would let everyone know. Soon, the worried mother ran into the room to see her son. Darren said, "Don't worry too much. He will be able to be discharged soon." Charlie started to wave it off, saying that everything was fine with him. Mom, with tears in her eyes, turned to Ross. Let's first transfer you to the hospital where you were last time. After the accident, all sorts of complications may arise, so we need to be careful." At this time, the young man was very worried that his parents would not believe him if he told them that he and his teacher had crashed into a sashimi knife delivery vehicle. Then a doctor and a nurse entered the room. The man in glasses greeted the patient and asked how he was feeling. Charlie replied that everything was fine. Sophia immediately stood up to greet and introduce herself. The doctor reassured her, saying that the injuries were not as serious as they seemed. He said that the operation was successful, so all that was left to do was eat well and rest. The mother said that she was thinking about transferring her son to Sebuol Hospital, where he had recently been treated. The doctor smiled kindly and said, "Of course, do as you see fit." Charlie was shocked by his words. Did the doctor really not know the whole situation? The man shared that the head of the surgery department was a good friend of his, so he could call him if Sophia wanted. But he noted that in Charlie's condition, he would advise him to stay in this hospital. He began to refer to the fact that doctors in such large hospitals always have a lot of patients. In the case of Sebuol Hospital, the doctors have a lot of outside work, of course. When it comes to life and death, big hospitals are better. But in the case of Ross's patient, he doesn't need emergency treatment, but rather intensive care. The doctor explained that this was only his opinion, and the right to choose, of course, remains with the parents. The man assured that although the head of the hospital, Sebuol, was quite a busy person, he always answered his calls. After his words, Darren and Charlie looked at each other with a smile. The doctor asked if she should call him right now. Sophia immediately began to refuse because she did not want to disturb the man at such a late hour. The mother decided to first discuss this issue with her husband when he arrived. The doctor responded accommodatingly, "As you wish." However, he asked his mother to leave the room for a while. The man explained that he needed to undress the patient and examine the wounds, worried that the sight would be too much for her. Sophia agreed with understanding and went out into the corridor. The doctor then began to cut the bandages around the student's wound. He said, "The threads are already coming off. Usually it takes half a month. There will be no need to stitch it up again since everything is almost healed." He admitted that this is the first time he has seen something like this. Charlie thanked him for telling his mother. "Do you know why I did this?" the doctor asked the guy. The doctor began to tell a story. "When I went to study abroad, my younger brother joined a gang. He always compared himself to me, and then shouted to his parents that he learned to use a knife better than me. And then one day he got a knife wound, there was a huge amount of blood, but he knew that he was in the hospital where I worked, so he refused treatment. Although in the end it was me who named the time of death." Charlie looked at the man with sympathy and remained silent. Soon the doctor finished bandaging and said, "I heard that you are a master in using fists, so I will have one request." He said, "You can come or send someone here as much as you want, but do not kill or die yourself." Ross listened carefully to his request, "And I decided to ask if you don't like it, then wouldn't it be easier to refuse such work?" The doctor said that even if he didn't like her, there was nothing he could do, because no one should die simply because they couldn't find a suitable hospital. The student was worried. "What if you have problems?" To which the doctor admitted that he had earned enough for a comfortable life, and if his license was revoked, he would simply go abroad. Charlie smiled and thanked him from the bottom of his heart. The doctor laughed. "No, I should be the one thanking you. Such cases are not covered by insurance, so the check will be hefty." Darren and Ross grinned, the young man said. "I have no doubt about it." However, the next phrase shocked the guys. The man said, "If next time you decide to die on my operating table, then I will sell you for organs in secret from your parents." With this, he said goodbye and wished them a good rest. Charlie sat on his bed, completely taken aback by what he had heard. Soon a week passed, and the young man returned home. In the morning, he was getting ready for school, but his wounds were still bandaged. After a while, the student was completely ready and left the room. Mom, hearing his footsteps, came out of her bedroom and said that she wanted to talk to him. Sophia was surprised why the young man put on a uniform, since the doctor told him to rest at home for a couple more days after being discharged. Charlie assured her that everything was fine. Since he could walk, there was no reason to stay at home. But the boy noticed an envelope in his mother's hands and asked what it was. She started to take out a bill for 50 million won from him. Ross thought about what kind of bastard Lee Guantek was, to mock people like that. The young man began to claim that it could be returned later. Sophia felt very uncomfortable with this situation. The student moved towards the exit and began to put on his shoes. The father, who was also about to leave, asked, "Should I give you a ride?" Charlie was a little confused at first, but quickly agreed. Then Jim hugged his son and they left together. Charlie felt uneasy about his father's behavior. Sometime later, the two of them were riding in a car. There was a tense atmosphere in the air, but no one dared to speak. Suddenly, the father decided to turn to his son. "Do you by any chance want to tell me anything?" he asked him. Jim said, "If not, then no, I won't ask anymore." The student admitted that he actually wanted to. Unfortunately, he couldn't tell earlier. Charlie answered honestly that he had gotten into a fight, and his father gripped the steering wheel at this news. The young man continued, "There was a gang behind the guys with whom I recently fought at school." Jim listened to him attentively and thought. The student said there were some problems, but they eventually came to an agreement that the gang would not appear at the school again. adding that several people were injured but no one died. The father asked why his son lied about being in an accident. It turned out that the guy just didn't want to worry his mother. Charlie apologized to Jim for this. "You know how much your mother sacrificed for your father?" he asked the student. Of course, Charlie didn't know, but then he saw the photo in the car. It depicted a mother in a special mask holding a child together with her father. The young man decided to answer that he knew, although in fact he didn't know the whole story, but he guessed something like that. In fact, when Sophia was giving birth, she was taken to the operating room. There were complications, so she had to breathe through a mask, but she gave birth to Charlie. Jim said sternly, "I don't care, but never make your mother cry. Can you handle that?" The young man looked down and agreed with understanding. The father thanked him for telling him the whole truth. Soon, Charlie arrived at school. The guy immediately went to see his friend, the physical education teacher Darren. The teacher did not expect to see the captain, especially immediately after discharge. It turned out that the student was allowed to be discharged so early. The doctor said that he had some kind of special physique, which he himself saw for the first time. "This is of course good, but somehow suspicious. Strange, right?" he asked the teacher. Darren smiled, because the captain had been strange long before this, and Charlie asked what was new. During this time, strange rumors spread throughout the school that Charlie is on the verge of life and death after being stabbed, or that he died, and there are guys who say they saw him get stabbed. The young man became interested. It seemed that many people breathed a sigh of relief. He suggested taking a little walk. Darren asked in surprise where, and Ross reminded him that the teacher himself had asked him for something last time. The man remembered and exclaimed joyfully, "Oh, you mean this?" The student smiled and asked for a list of names. Meanwhile, in the first class office, the students were having lunch. One of them, a guy with glasses, was eating modestly alone. Suddenly, his meal is interrupted by an unexpected blow to the back of the head. The boy, perplexed, turns towards the offender. "What, not enough?" the hooligan asked brazenly. Stuttering with fear, the boy answered, "No." The bully snatched the chopsticks from the student's hands. "Oh my God, our moon ki genie." He started eating his food and saying, "You idiot, if you eat only meat, your blood will thicken, you'll overeat and walk around with jelly instead of blood. But don't be afraid, your brother will take care of your health." The hooligan ate the meat and Kajini thanked him. But he himself was sweating like a river from fear. Suddenly he asked with feigned anxiety, "But why haven't you eaten anything yourself? Does our Kijini have no appetite?" And after that, the bully forcibly shoved food into the student's mouth with a spoon. Classmates watched what was happening and laughed at Moon Kijin. The bully now grabbed the guy by the jaw with all his might and shoved food into him. The bully scooped up a spoonful of rice and held it out to the boy with a cruel face. And again he cruelly fed the young man, who didn't even have time to chew. At that moment, Charlie walked into their class. The bully noticed the student, but did not immediately understand who he was, so he began to answer him insolently. But when he turned around, horror appeared in his eyes. He realized that it was that same Charlie Ross. The hooligan immediately stood up and bowed before him, greeting him respectfully. The guy started to introduce himself but was quickly shut up by Ross, who was looking for Moon Kajin. Charlie started looking around because he was told that the student was in that class. The bully quickly pointed his finger at a young man wearing glasses sitting nearby. Kijin began to tremble in anticipation of something terrible. Ross approached the young man and addressed him. "Are you Kijin?" The boy somehow turned his head in his direction. Fear gripped him. His body did not stop shaking, and sweat poured down his face, because this was the same scary guy from the rumors. Charlie realized that this was the one he needed and asked to follow him. But Kijin decided to gather his will into a fist and ask, "Why?" All the classmates who saw what was happening were horrified by the way this boy responded to Charlie. Then a bully jumped out from behind Charlie and started to be rude to his classmate in glasses, saying that he had completely lost his mind. He approached him and started yelling in anger, "Why are you being insolent to your elder?" "Hey, get out of here," Charlie ordered cheekily. The hooligan immediately jumped away from him in fear. Ross walked up to Kijin and leaned on the desk. The young man moved away a little. His whole body was shaking. The guy was incredibly afraid. The young man smiled amiably and joked, "Why, for bread, Goldfinch?" and then asked him to step outside for a second. Kijin started mumbling something. The guy didn't understand what they wanted from him. Charlie continued to smile and moved closer to the boy. He grabbed his hand. "Enough chatter, follow me," he finally said, and dragged the guy along with him. Suddenly, Ross realized that something was wrong. He looked around. Everyone around was looking at them. The young man decided to calm them down, saying that everything was fine and they could go about their business. All the boys started covering themselves with their hands, shaking with fear, and praying that the young man wouldn't beat them up. In another class, the kids were actively communicating with each other on various topics. However, one girl sat apart from the others. Suddenly, someone approached her and asked, "Are you Cha So-yeon?" When she raised her head, she saw Charlie and Kijin in front of her. She said sheepishly, "Yes, it's me." Ross introduced himself in a friendly manner and invited her to come with him to talk. After she found out that it was that same Charlie in front of her, she was overcome with fear. The guy thought that the girl was busy, that's why he didn't answer. But she immediately stood up and shouted, "No!" Now the three of them walked further to another class. In the hallway, they met three guys who recognized Charlie. For some reason, Cha So-yeon was very scared when she saw these three. Ross noticed that the girl began to tremble. He realized that something was wrong. Three students bowed before the student. One of them introduced himself as Cho Se-heon from the 2nd grade. Charlie waved his hand at them to get them off him quickly. Se-ho looked at the young man with confusion. Charlie was annoyed that they were blocking the entire corridor, so the three immediately moved away and apologized. They bowed low again as Charlie left. After some time, Charlie gathered several guys in the office of the sports club. He told them, "I would like to open a sports section, and Darren, that is, teacher Ken Evans, will be a mentor." The guys sat there, completely confused about what was happening. Charlie decided to check if they had any questions. Kijin decided to ask, "What kind of sport are we going to do?" The young man said that it would be general physical training, self-defense, and something like kyoku. Cha So-yeon was curious why with them. Ross thought for a moment and replied, "Just because." The assembled students did not understand him. Charlie continued, "I just want to be friends with you and relax and go for walks together." This answer raised even more questions among the guys. Darren realized it was time to catch his breath and cleared his throat. The teacher explained that they were not going to force them, so if they didn't want to, they could refuse. But if the guys register, it will help a lot. Ken Evans pointed to the forms for those who want to join and said, "Anyway, even if you don't register, stay here. Food will be coming soon," Charlie said with a terrified face. "Well, how about it? It'll be fun, won't it?" The atmosphere in the room became tense. Darren asked his friend to make his face simpler. They are not in Africa after all. The teacher suddenly asked, "By the way, why is she here?" Kate stood up from her chair and introduced herself. As it turned out, she would be the manager of the sports section. The girl with kind eyes took the forms and began asking who needed it. Darren turned to Charlie. Why did she come here? She was one step away from a prestigious university. So why should she waste her time on the sports section? Charlie didn't understand it either because it wasn't he who brought her here. The young man told how he accidentally bumped into her in the corridor, and she burst into tears and wouldn't let go. Darren said discontentedly, "Okay, I don't care. Do as you wish." But Charlie himself didn't know anything, so he decided that what would be, would be. Soon a courier entered the office, bringing the tonkas. He laid out the order for the guys on the table. Meanwhile, Cheryl was peeping from behind the door. Everyone had already sat down at the table, but Charlie still noticed the girl. When she realized that she had been seen, she started to run away. Suddenly, someone shouted after her to call her. The girl turned around. It was Ross. He was wondering why the student was peeping. Embarrassed, Cheryl began to scream indignantly. "What? Who else was peeping?" The girl began to assure that she had not been spying on them. "Well, if not, then go," he answered her sternly. The guy turned around and walked towards the office. The girl struggled with her feelings and looked after him. Finally, when he was almost to the door, she shouted his name. She asked, "Are you serious about leaving?" "Yes, I'm leaving," Charlie said. She asked, embarrassed. "So what? You don't even suspect me of anything?" Ross turned away and said, "If you want to do something suspicious, try it." As a result, after these words, he slammed the door behind him. Cheryl was left alone on the street, angry at the guy's behavior. Cheryl watched the sports club practice from afar. The poor students ran after Charlie with all their might. It was real torture for them. Ross looked back at them and smiled encouragingly. "Let's just do one more circle." The guys, already tired, were not at all happy with what they heard. The blonde watching them was clearly unhappy with Charlie's behavior towards her, but she didn't dare say anything yet. Soon the students finished running and fell to the ground, all red and out of breath. A friendly Kate handed out refreshing soda to everyone. Kijin was extremely glad that the training was over and he could drink in peace. The guy grabbed the jar and began to greedily swallow the contents because he was able to survive this day. Then Charlie, who was warming up at that moment, addressed the guys. "So, shall we begin our full-fledged training?" This statement made Kijin choke on his soda. Everyone looked at the young man in bewilderment, but Ross did not understand what he said. He explained that it was just a warm-up, because if you don't warm up before training, you can easily get sick. The desperate students already understood that they were finished. It was too hard for them. A little later, they started playing ball, and Kijin got hit hard in the face when the ball was thrown at him. The guy fell down from pain and surprise, and his glasses flew off his face. Charlie shouted at him, "Hey, how can you take the ball with your face like that?" He asked if everything was okay with the guy. He stood up and said yes. Darren turned to Ross. "So you weren't aiming right at his face on purpose?" Charlie became angry at such impudence. Ken Evans reminded his student that this was school. Charlie said he knew it, but they were serving again anyway. After his words, the teacher casually threw the ball at Charlie. "I'll show you what it means to aim straight at the face," the young man said terrifyingly. Ken deliberately teased the guy by enticing him with his finger. Immediately after a moment, Charlie serves the ball, kicking it with all his might. Evans is already grinning in anticipation, and with one precise blow, he hits the ball upward. And after it lands, it kicks back to the other side. Charlie reacts instantly and rushes towards the ball. He stops the ball with his foot, which was moving at high speed. Then, he powerfully kicks him into the opponent's area. Ken had to do a handstand to block the throw. Ross kicked the ball back at him. The two were in a brutal gambling frenzy. The ball was flying so fast that it seemed impossible to track its trajectory. The rest of the teams watched from the sidelines. As expected, this place was scary. After a while, the game ended, and the students went to the wash basins. Charlie shared with the teacher, "I thought I got a bad body, but no. Compared to the rest of the guys, it's not that bad." Cha So-yeon talked to Ki-jin while they were washing up, worrying about his condition. Evans warned Charlie that the boys' bodies might not be able to handle it every day like they did today, so he suggested doing it twice a week. At that moment, Cheryl began to approach the guys. The girl gathered her strength and called Charlie. "You again?" the young man asked the blonde, approaching them with displeasure. "I want to sign up too," Cheryl suddenly said. Ross glanced sideways at the rest of the group. The boys looked worried, so Charlie sternly told her that she couldn't. The girl began to be indignant. Why only she couldn't do this? "What other section for a graduate?" the brunette asked her. Cheryl got angry and shouted, "So what if it's senior year? I'm not going to university anyway." Here she noted that Kate was also in the circle. Charlie put her in her place abruptly, saying that Diaz was doing well in school, unlike some people. These words deeply hurt the blonde. She blushed with shame. She looked at Kate furiously, as if it was all her fault. Snow White was very embarrassed by such pressure. Without saying anything, Cheryl angrily walked away from the boys. Charlie just looked after her silently. Soon the lessons were over and Ross and Kate walked home together. They were standing in front of the crosswalk. "Cheryl can't be enrolled in the section at all?" the girl asked cautiously. It seemed to her that she sincerely wanted this. The guy knew that all this was empty chatter, especially since the other guys were afraid of her. Here the green light for pedestrians finally came on, and Charlie went, and Kate asked after him, "But if we spend time together, then she might change." Later, the young man calmly walked home through the city. Suddenly, he received a call on his phone from an unknown number. Ross decided to pick up the phone and started a conversation. It was a female voice speaking in French, and the student immediately realized that it was Michelle. Charlie remembered giving her his number at a French restaurant. "What do you want?" the guy asked. The girl answered flirtatiously, "As if you don't know. Are you the type who likes to get a girl's attention and then pretend it never happened?" she asked the young man. Charlie reminded him that he was still a schoolboy, and Michelle reminded that she was French and smiled. She said that the guy should keep his word and asked about today. Charlie refused, explaining that he was injured and now covered in bandages. These words excited the French woman. Maybe she's a crazy, preoccupied woman, the student thought to himself. But today still won't work. Let's do it on Saturday, Ross suggested, and Michelle agreed. She said in a languid voice, "I love you." But the young man immediately hung up, without responding to the provocation. The guy picked up the pace in confusion. What was she doing anyway? After some time, Charlie returned home. He saw his father talking on the phone with someone in the living room. Jim quickly began to end the conversation, saying that he would call later. The father put the phone away and began to greet his son. When asked who he was talking to, Jim, a little nervously, replied that it was just one of the company's clients. "Go wash up and rest quickly, hurry up," the man said. The young man entered his room. "What was that?" He didn't understand. Judging by the expression on my father's face, he is definitely hiding something. Jim was still sitting in the living room, looking at the phone, upset. Suddenly the door opened sharply and Charlie came out of the room. He turned to his father, who turned in his direction. Charlie had already changed his clothes and asked his father if he wanted to go for a walk with him. Jim started saying that the student should go for a walk, but he didn't want to. However, he immediately stopped himself and admitted that he also needed to take a walk. After all this time, are we finally going for a walk together? The man asked hopefully. The young man looked at him with a tender gaze. Soon the two of them went out for a walk through the night city. Charlie decided to ask what happened to his dad. As if not understanding, he asked his son, "What are you talking about?" The brunette stopped and said, "If you don't want to talk, then I won't ask anymore." Jim remembered saying those same words to his son recently and chuckled. He put his arm around the guy's shoulder and confessed, "This time you got me. To be honest, it's not like nothing happened. In fact, I was going to import and sell cars from France," the father said. They sat down on a bench in the park and he continued. "At the beginning, we thought the risk would not be so high if we ordered about 50 units for display and test drive, so we sent a request to the head office. However, it turned out that a problem had arisen. The Sojong Group opened a branch of Sojong Motors and submitted a proposal to purchase the same cars as Jim. Charlie was angry because his father wanted to get into the new market, and here were fucking thieves. And then the young man realized that he had just called Jim father in his thoughts. Meanwhile, the man said that he had recently received a call from France. They said they would give them exclusive rights to sell if they ordered 500 units at a time, although they said they would give them the best possible consideration compared to those who had priority negotiating rights. They made these terms on purpose, knowing that Jim would not be able to accept them, because they were confident that they could get a better deal if Jim's side pulled out of the agreement. Charlie asked what kind of cars you were planning to buy, and Dad said a Supra. The young man knew that the Supra was a luxury sedan that cost around 100 million. He began to wonder how much it would cost to order 500 of these. Now Jim will have to either give up the money he left as a deposit to order 50 cars, or spend everything on the company's balance sheet to buy 500. But the losses in both cases will be the same. The father admitted that he was ashamed in front of his son and mother, since he had invested the money he had received by mortgaging the house. If this business did fail, we're in trouble. "Forgive me for showing myself like this," the man said desperately. The young man looked at his father with understanding. Charlie said he was fine, but his mom, "This is what worries me the most. I have been trying not to show it all this time," Jim admitted. The guy explained that it was still noticeable on the man. "That's how it is," Dad answered embarrassedly. "Unfortunately, the latest news made my father lose control of his facial expression even more. It turned out that the board members who were originally supposed to come next week were coming this week, and Charlie guessed that they wanted to get this all sorted out quickly. If on this one, then tomorrow or the day after tomorrow," he clarified. "Tomorrow they said they wanted to take a day off and meet for lunch on Sunday," Jim replied. Then Charlie turned to him. He asked if he could go with them. Jim refused him, saying that Dad would figure it out himself. Charlie reminded them that they knew he spoke French very well. As for the translation, the father's gaze dropped and dimmed. The young man could not stand it and suddenly stood up in front of his father. "In war, all means are good. If we do not unite and do not apply all our efforts, then nothing will work," he said. Charlie looked sternly into Jim's eyes. He didn't expect this from his son and was a little surprised. But in the end, he agreed. Let the son help his father, even if the result is bad. Now they had to try to pretend that nothing was happening, so as not to hurt their mother. A little later, Charlie came home. Mom was relaxing on the couch in front of the TV and asked, "Where is Dad?" The brunette replied that Jim said he wanted to get some more fresh air. The young man began to enter his room and heard Sophia quietly say, "Something happened." He closed the door behind him and stopped. A man also needs time to be alone, Charlie thought. At that moment, the phone in his pants pocket rang. The young man picked up the phone and began a dialogue. It turned out to be Michelle, who called him again. It turned out that the girl showed up just in time for Ross. She started flirting. "Did you want to hear my voice?" Charlie explained that he would have to push his promise back by 1 week, which Michelle found too rude. There were some pretty big problems at home, he explained. The Frenchwoman agreed, but said that Monday was the last concession. The student had no choice but to agree to this day. The joyful girl asked him to be sure to keep his promise and said goodbye to him. After the call, Michelle continued to indulge in amorous fantasies about Charlie for some time. Charlie chuckled. "That's also." The young man decided to use the computer and turned it on. He remembered that he seemed to have some money left in a French account. In Korean won, there should be about 100 million and 5,000. The young man couldn't set up internet banking. He also forgot his account number. And if he had gone there, no one would have believed that he was the Charlie Ross about whom enemy troops had made up legends. He told Darren everything that had happened on the phone, and he asked, "Don't you think this is not okay at all?" "Don't tell me, but the closest branch is in Hong Kong, so let's call there on Monday," Ross replied. "One way or another, this is about taking care of your mother," the man explained. Be that as it may, the young man must try. Soon Monday arrived and Charlie and Jim went to the Namsan Hotel. They drove up to the main entrance. Getting out of the car, my father said, "There will be 2 board members and 1 translator from my company. I told them that you are my son, but I will tell the other side that you are an assistant translator." After this, he addressed his son affectionately. The man smiled and thanked him. Charlie looked at Jim, a little confused. The brunette decided to try to help those who took him in, because of him, they had to go through a lot. And so the 2 of them entered the hotel. "They're already here," Jim explained, pointing to the people. When Charlie looked up at them, his body seemed to be pierced by an electric shock. The man began to approach them with a confident step. Ross couldn't believe what he was seeing. He was dumbfounded when he stopped in front of the young man. The guy remembered the meeting before the fateful fight, where the man talked about Maxwell, how their leader was confident that this time they would definitely finish off the enemy. In front of the young man stood the same man who had commanded them in Africa. It was the spitting image of Sharon. Charlie just couldn't believe his eyes. How did this happen? "Good afternoon." A man in an elegant suit extended his hand in greeting. Fear, misunderstanding, bewilderment were in the young man's eyes. Jim shook his hand in return as a sign of greeting. Jim stepped forward and talked to him while Charlie stood dumbfounded. At this time, behind the man's back, a brazen blonde was hitting on some girl. "Stephen, behave normally. We are in Korea," the man ordered him sternly. The blonde left the girl and, smiling, approached him. Charlie's eyes widened in surprise. "Stephen, this puppy too? What's going on? What's wrong?" Jim, who saw the boy's condition, suddenly asked the young man. The student came to his senses and said that everything was fine. Father reminded that it was time to introduce ourselves. The young man began to speak in French. "This is the General Director of Ross U Motors, Jim Ross. I am the Assistant Translator, Charlie Ross." The man also introduced himself in French as Sharon and praised the guy for his excellent pronunciation. His manner of speech seemed familiar to him, and Charlie thanked him a little nervously. Sharon introduced Stephen, who is in charge of sales in Asia, and the blonde man also greeted the young man. Ross was confused as to how Stephen had become responsible for sales when he wasn't even responsible for his buddy in the pants. Soon they all stood up together and sat down at the table. The waitress came up to them and asked what they wanted. Stephen began to lick his lips in a disgusting and vulgar manner. Charlie realized that the blonde hadn't changed at all. It was clear from his whole appearance what he was thinking. Sharon turned to the worried man, and he quickly calmed down. Stephen turned away and looked away in shame. The vice president asked, "Is Charlie Ross a common name in Korea?" At this moment, the young man tensed up. The man became worried that he was speaking too quickly because the boy did not answer him. But the student quickly came to his senses and explained that it could be said that it was quite common. And taking advantage of the moment, he clarified, "You probably have a friend with that name?" Sharon replied that he simply asked because he had heard the name somewhere. "Your name seemed familiar to me too," Ross said with a grin. The man was clearly intrigued by this phrase. By this time, the waitress had served the drinks ordered earlier. The girl put the glasses on the table. Sharon took his cocktail and asked to stop with the pointless talk and get down to business. Jim's translator explained to him that it was time to start talking business. "That's what we'll do," the father replied. "Vice President, unfortunately, it is difficult for our side to accept your company's unexpected offer," said Jim. "So I would like to ask you to relax the purchase conditions in order to obtain the exclusive right to sell." The translator began to convey his words to Sharon. However, he said that they would not change the terms, and explained, "If you like, Ross U Motors can purchase 50 units according to the original contract. But in that case, Sojong Motors will also have the right to purchase this model. Capitalism in our country and yours is not so different, is it?" And he added, "Healthy competition never hurt anyone, you understand, right?" Charlie knew that Shahran was just teasing, which was just his style. Jim reminded us of the contract. We had already paid half for 50 units, and according to the contract, the other half was to be paid if Ross U Motors were given exclusive rights to service the Supra, right? The vice president acknowledged that they would receive exclusive rights to service, as well as equipment that met Gaunt's regulations, the necessary parts, and personnel that would meet their requirements. "Really?" Jim asked happily and explained, "We will sign contracts with services in 10 regions of the country and will be able to carry out replacement in the shortest possible time. Of course, you will only need to comply with the regulations of the head office. But for your information, these conditions only apply to cars imported by Ross U Motors. We received a positive response from Sojong Motors on the same conditions," answered Sharon. Jim was amazed at what he had just heard, and the vice president sipped his drink with a grin. One of Jim's company members lost his temper and shouted that the other side was going too far, threatening that if things continued like this, they would take legal action. No, you can't go up against Shahran with something like that, Charlie knew for sure. The man put the glass on the table. He got angry. Well, since your CEO is here, then we can consider this an official statement. The vice president raised his hand to his face. Sorry to hear such a thing. So Shahran decided to clarify something. Standing up abruptly, he said, "It was your company that decided to declare war." Everyone immediately chased after the departing second side, trying to explain that this was not what they meant. Then, behind Shahran's back, someone sternly asked him to wait. The man turned to the one who had addressed him in bewilderment. It was Charlie, the young man begging for a little more time. "Give me time?" Shahran asked haughtily. He explained that there was nothing worse than wasted time. "I don't ask for much, 1 week, and 1 night in the middle of it, that's enough," said the guy. "Mr. Ross, I don't think you have the right to make such a proposal. Can you take responsibility?" The vice president replied. Charlie turned around. His father was looking at his son intently. "Do you have any solution?" Jim asked. "To be honest, not right now, but it's better than losing positions right now," the young man admitted. One of the board members was worried that if they didn't find a way out within this week, they wouldn't even have anything to say, so he suggested that they just apologize now and not ask for negotiations. At this point, Charlie raised his voice at them and said, "Instead of losing and making ourselves look weak, we need to try harder." Jim covered his face with his hands, deep in thought. Shahran and Stephen had been watching them the whole time, and then the boy's father raised his eyes full of determination, and he asked for his words to be translated. Now, in this place, to perceive all of Charlie's words as mine, all of his decisions as my decisions, he strictly instructed. A slight smile appeared on the son's face after hearing this. One of the heads began to get indignant, turning to the director. But Jim was adamant in his decision. Charlie thanked his father for his support and encouragement. Shahran, seeing this whole situation, grins with interest, and he clarifies. That is, if you cannot purchase 500 cars in a week, then you can calmly give up the right to provide service? The young man smiled and asked them not to worry about it. However, the vice president did not understand what he meant by 1 night. Suddenly, the guy said in a frightening voice, "You will understand. Wait, this is something unusual." Stephen started to shrug when Shahran turned to look at him. The 2 chapters and the translator were in complete despair, but the father was inspired and proud of his son. "Korea is an amazing country, Mr. Ross. You are very similar to a person I knew," the man admitted. Charlie asked to answer exactly whether they agreed. Shahran answered in the affirmative and asked when that very night was. The student explained that he would contact them about this later. The VP warned that they had a specific schedule as well, so he would have to make sure Charlie gave advance notice, and they shook hands. Ross pierced his interlocutors with his gaze. If these are really those same Shahran and Stephen, then he will be able to cope with them. "Then let's end it here," the man suggested. He walked towards the exit and called Stephen to follow him. The heads immediately began to bombard the director with questions about what he had planned and whether he understood that he would now be indebted to the other side. "No, it's not like that," Jim answered them. First, they had to come up with a way out of this situation. The men looked at him in complete bewilderment. The father left his workers alone, leaving the place with his son. A little later, the 2 of them were already driving in a car. Jim decided to approach the young man. "Are you really my son?" the man asked an unexpected question. Charlie tried to pretend he didn't understand him. "Still claiming that you learned French online?" Dad asked incredulously. "Even if I tell you, you won't believe it. No, you simply won't be able to believe it," the guy explained. Jim smiled and said he understood the guy. However, then he remembered something else. The man strictly ordered him not to even think about asking the gang for help, and Charlie agreed. He also asked not to tell my mother anything. Charlie understood everything that was asked of him. The father looked sternly at the student, after which he thoughtfully turned away to the road and leaned on his hand. The young man watched his behavior with a little excitement, and soon I decided to take out my phone. He wrote a message saying, "We need to meet." Arriving at the house, they got out of the car, and the student announced that he was going to go somewhere. Charlie said there was one place he felt he could go for help. The father repeated again that his son should not dare to join any groups. "I understand, don't worry," the young man assured. After that, Jim went home. Charlie watched his father until the end, and when the door to the entrance slammed shut, he set off on his way. Shooting from behind the barricades, the bullets flew deafeningly. The enemies on the other side resisted. Suddenly, a military vehicle drove up with several more opponents. The soldiers were forced to take cover again from the barrage of bullets. Darren, hiding behind a tree, tried to shoot at them. but each time he received even more attacks in response. Here he shouted to call the commander. Charlie asked to be patient with him a little longer. After that, a friend nearby gave him a lift, and Ross flew up with a high jump. The young man climbed onto the roof of the house and immediately rushed along it. Another soldier stood up behind him and followed close on his heels. From above, he saw that the enemy had a handheld anti-tank grenade launcher. The enemy already had him ready. A man with an RPG in his hands took aim to take down the soldiers, but Charlie couldn't let that happen. The young man ran and jumped, landing on the ground near the enemy. There was immediate commotion on the enemy's side. The commander did not wait and immediately began shooting at everyone who was there. By accident, the man fired an RPG straight into the car they were hiding behind, causing it to explode. Someone tried to run out of the fire, screaming in pain, but Charlie kept shooting, sparing no one, killing all enemies. The fire from the explosion grew, and black smoke billowed out in clouds. And the only one who came out of this fire was Charlie, who announced over the radio, "The capture of Zone K is complete." The team members ran up to the commander, looking around. Darren grinned. The commander, as usual, decided to show off. But Charlie reprimanded him, saying, "Puppy, if you think it's undeserved, then show what you're capable of." "Okay then," his comrade smiled. Ross asked what losses they had suffered. As it turned out, according to preliminary estimates, 4 people were slightly injured. There were no deaths or serious injuries, but for some reason Stephen was not visible. Darren started calling the blonde around the area. The commander was tense about this situation. He knew him well. Meanwhile, Stephen licked his lips with lust in his eyes. In front of him in the house, a trembling girl cowered in fear in the corner. The blonde said in a terrifying tone, "Don't be afraid, I just want to play a game with you, I won't kill you." He pressed himself against the girl, breathing heavily into her back. She said that she didn't want to. Animal passion took hold of the man, no matter how much you don't want it. In such a situation, your opinion is the last thing that worries me. Just then, Charlie entered the house looking for the horny bastard. Hearing footsteps and a voice, Stephen froze in horror. He let go of the girl and turned around with an awkward expression on his face. Charlie became furious when he saw the whole picture. The blonde tried to save the situation by making excuses. "You came just in time. There's a surviving civilian here." Unable to tolerate such rudeness, the young man hit the soldier and ordered him to shut up. Ross started yelling at the concerned man, "Who are you telling me? You said it yourself, it's written all over your face when you're doing something crazy. Animal, how are you better than those bandits?" Charlie beat the blonde with all his fury. Covered in blood, Stephen begged for forgiveness because it was only this once. Charlie sat at the bus stop, remembering this story. This time, Stephen had the same expression on his face. "Have you been here long?" Suddenly, a question disturbed his thoughts. The young man answered Darren that no. Since he had just arrived, he asked to go somewhere where they could talk calmly. The boy got into the teacher's car and they drove off. "What happened?" Darren asked worriedly. Ross replied disappointedly, "It's Stephen." The man looked at the commander in bewilderment. The student said that he met a blonde man who was with Sharon. Are they still alive? Darren was surprised, to which Charlie replied that since they met, of course they were alive. The man was curious as to where they were now. Ross said meekly and sternly, "Namsan Hotel." Gritting his teeth in anger, the comrade tensed up, and he said, "Adding gas, let's go right now." The student explained that they would talk first, since the two were in business. Sharon was now the vice president of the Gaunt Company, and Stephen was a board member. Darren started laughing hysterically at these words, but he quickly calmed down and put on a stony expression, declaring that he expected nothing less from them, and again offered to go. "What's wrong with your 'let's go'?" Charlie asked discontentedly. The angry man began to appear. "They think that you died, and after you I will follow. Let's tell them that we are here." He could not accept that Stephen was a member of the board of a huge company, because he was dumber than him, Darren said. "Yes, if he can manage a big company, then it's time for me to become a general in the French army." Charlie decided to answer honestly. "You are worth each other, and if you take a closer look, you might even be dumber." But Darren did not calm down. "These bastards stabbed us in the back, and now they live happily ever after. Even a dumbass like me knew that, but you didn't," he asked. Ross suspected that there might be something they didn't know about, so it was worth investigating further. Darren gripped the steering wheel and shouted, "If there is something we don't know, then we need to shake it out of these bastards." The commander tried to say something else, but the man was no longer listening to him. He explained that Charlie could do as he saw fit, but he decided to do it his own way and picked up even more speed. At that moment, Ross shouted across the car, "Darren!" He looked at the commander with apprehension. "Don't you dare do anything until we have a proper plan," the young man said. And he added that this is an order. Darren looked at the angry Charlie, after which he lowered his gaze, saying, "I'm guilty. I went crazy as soon as I heard the names of these people." "Forget it. This isn't the first time this has happened to you," the guy said, calming down. Here the comrade decided to ask how about asking Guantek for help. The young man turned away, looking out the window and thinking, this makes sense. His organization can help with collecting information, and in case of a fight, they would not be superfluous. However, Charlie had a but on this matter, so he asked to forget about this option. After all, they don't look like the kind of people who would go to bandits for help. Darren smiled understandingly at the commander. Although Ross said so, he doesn't have a single idea yet. If it were possible to isolate at least one of them, something could be done. His thoughts were interrupted by a ringtone. It was Michelle calling again, and at such a time too. And then an idea struck the young man's head. He happily picked up the phone and greeted his French friend. "Charlie, are you done with your chores?" the girl asked. "No, we're still at a dead end," he admitted. Michelle thought that everything was fine when she heard his cheerful voice, but she was wrong, and Ross meanwhile asked where they would meet tomorrow. The Frenchwoman didn't know where to go. She didn't care as long as she was with him. It was then that Charlie had the opportunity to propose. "How about a hotel?" Michelle was delighted by this question. She was pleased at how surprisingly proactive the young man was. The guy said that he was treating her and asked her to bring her girlfriend, and from these words the beauty happily got up from her chair and began asking about the place and time. As a result, a meeting was arranged at the Namsan Hotel at 7 in the evening. Michelle immediately began choosing an outfit for tomorrow, humming a melody in a good mood. "What is it?" Darren asked the guy. The young man explained, "A girl, a very beautiful French woman." The man looked vulgarly at the commander, who was not sitting idle. But Ross quickly dispelled his dirty thoughts by reminding him of Steven's opponent. At this moment, Darren finally understood the boy's idea. "Well, shall we cast the line?" Charlie said, and his comrade nodded approvingly. Ross called and asked to be connected to number 1901. Soon his call was answered. The young man introduced himself and reminded that he was calling about their agreement. He asked if they had time at 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening. The young man knew that this idiot didn't even have the right to decide. He just needed to get Sharan's consent. The voice on the phone agreed to the time and date and suggested meeting in the recreation area. Ross smiled and replied that, of course, they could meet there. "By the way, tomorrow I have a meeting there with very beautiful girls, so if you happen to see me there, don't get the wrong idea and continue doing your own thing," Charlie said. "That's how it is, I'm even jealous." "Well, then I'll switch off," said the interlocutor. Darren was surprised by such a calm reaction, as if Steven had changed. The young man said that it was unlikely. Most likely Sharan, or people from Sojong Motors were nearby, in front of whom he needed to keep up appearances. Charlie even decided to argue that all that was on the blonde's mind right now was evening and girls. Darren was disappointed and angry. Only the grave can correct such people. "Come to the hotel tomorrow by car," the commander asked. Michelle's friends are so beautiful that Steven will come running when he sees them. Even if he comes later, he is not the type to sit in a room alone. Charlie was sure that the blonde would come down to scout out the situation. And when the right moment comes, Darren will need to drag him into the car. Enraged by thoughts of Steven, the man promised that he would even look for a quiet place where he could drag this bastard, and asked not to interfere, as he wanted to personally wring his neck. Charlie drowned at his friends. Will he cope? "What, you think I can't handle some Steven?" Darren was indignant. "No, even with the previous body, you know that Steven is not someone to look down on. When you competed in arm wrestling, he won 1 out of 3, the commander reminded him. They remembered that time. All the guys gathered to cheer for Darren or Steven. At some point, it became clear to everyone that the blonde was losing. "You're finished," Darren said menacingly. He began to mock him. Where did his strength go? But Steven did not dare give up and continued the competition. Here, Darren said, "This is only with the right hand, and if we had fought with the left, even 100, even 1,000 times, I would have beaten him." Charlie knew this, but the problem was that that body belonged to Darren, and now he was Ken Evans. But Steven remained himself. The man asked not to worry because he himself is no slouch. But it didn't matter anymore, because if tomorrow Steven took their bait, they would have to deal with him first. And if not, then on Tuesday they will see what happens. Darren noted that if he was lucky, he would be able to find out the secret about their death, as well as help his father. If it works out, then that's good, of course, but you shouldn't try to be torn between two things. Don't rush to count the trophies ahead of time, Charlie answered. Otherwise, order yourself a tombstone in advance, the man continued. The comrades laughed loudly throughout the entire car. "I'm shaking all over," Darren admitted. Charlie said he felt the same way. Suddenly, the smile on the young man's face disappeared and his gaze became serious. He looked at the confident Darren and wondered what would happen if Steven hadn't lost his abilities. In that case, fighting him will be more difficult than fighting the entire Yuch gang. Soon, they arrived at Charlie's house. "I know a couple of good places you can choose from. I'll send you to the skating rink," said Darren. But Charlie refused. He was sure that the man could handle it himself. After that, they said goodbye and the comrade left. And in just a few minutes, the young man was in the hallway of the apartment. Charlie saw his dad in the kitchen, and it turned out that he was cooking porridge. Jim said that Sophia was a little sick. He told her a little about the negotiations. Since then, she lies in the living room without getting up, after which the father sent his son to rest. The next day, Charlie rode with Jim. The guy said that he contacted people who were well acquainted with the heads of Gaunt, assuring them that they would definitely get through. The father sighed heavily. He felt uneasy about the fact that he had put so much on him. "But Charlie," the man said to the young man, alarmed, "don't do anything that is not in keeping with your age and status," he asked. The boy was understanding of his father and agreed. Meanwhile, they had already arrived at the school gates, where the student got out of the car. His teacher, Ken Evans, was just waiting for him. They exchanged greeting glances. A little later, the student was already sitting in class. The guy, out of boredom and fatigue, began to slowly fall asleep. But he woke himself up in time, pulling at his cheeks, which amused Kate. Finally, it was time for the sports club to train. And just like last time, the poor students were exhausted by the jogging. Ross turned to them and pointed with his finger that there was still one lap left. This news did not please the already tired boys at all. But one way or another, everyone continued training. Sweet Kate cheered on the students as they ran past. Cheryl, who was nearby, watched this spectacle. Sometime after training, the brunette was walking down the corridor. The young man was suddenly called out by a female voice. It was Diaz who suggested going home together. The young man said that he was not going home because he had a meeting soon. "Is it really a girl?" Snow White asked, upset. He answered sternly to the teacher, Ken Evans. The persistent girl decided to go with him in this case. However, the guy suddenly quickened his pace, leaving his girlfriend behind, explaining that she couldn't, so they would meet later. She looked at the departing student with sadness in her eyes. Finally, Ross came out onto the main staircase of the school to go down. But a female voice called out to him again, this time more rudely. Cheryl stood behind him, wanting to talk to him. As soon as she started saying what she wanted, Charlie turned away abruptly and walked away, saying that he was busy at the moment. With such behavior, he offended and insulted the girl. And so, finally, the student reached the sports club office. He walked inside where Ken Evans was just about to leave. The young man was surprised that he even put on a tie. But Darren decided to approach the matter properly. Still, Ross thought it would be better without a tie, but the man did not understand why. The commander asked not to worry and to do as his comrade thought necessary, and asked if he had brought his things. As it turned out, all the students' things were in the car, so Darren suggested that he change there. But the brunette didn't like this idea because the man's car was the size of a tin can. "Do you have any idea what would happen to my job if someone started a rumor about me putting a student in my car and taking his uniform off?" Darren was angry. Charlie started making fun of him. Was the incomparable Darren scared? The teacher began to wave it off, admitting that he was a little afraid of the local head teacher. He turned away and walked towards the exit. However, before leaving, he said, "But not Steven." Ross crossed his arms and grinned. Got it. After some time, they arrived at the Namsen Hotel. The man stopped near the main entrance. Darren wanted to wait for him in the underground parking lot, but the guy assured him that there was no need to worry, because it was unlikely that Steven would recognize Darren, so they could meet near the recreation area in the coffee shop. "In a place like this, coffee would probably cost $20,000 to $30,000, said the teacher. "That's still cheap," Charlie noted. Then suddenly, Darren admitted, "To be honest, I'm afraid of my wife." "But not Steven," he said again furiously. Ross was embarrassed by this whole farce, so he did not dare say anything. "In any case, it's better if I'm next to you. We need to use all means. I'll go and leave the car, so you go out first," Darren said. After that, Charlie got out of the car, and with confident steps, he walked to the hotel. When he entered the lobby, there were many different people around. However, Michelle was not there yet, although it was almost 7. Suddenly, someone said hello to the guy. When he turned around, he saw a man. Ross looked at him and couldn't remember, so he himself helped him, saying, "So Dosuk, we met in the basement." Charlie remembered how that same So Dosuk snapped at him in the hallway. As it turned out, the man works here as a manager, so he said that if the young man needed anything, But before he could finish speaking, Charlie interrupted him with a request to leave. So Dosuk turned out to be understanding, so he didn't dare to suggest anything else. He said goodbye politely and wished them a good time. As the bandit left, the young man looked at him with distrust. Have these bastards really occupied this place? Ross sat down on the sofa in the hall and waited. The young man began to immerse himself in his thoughts. Everything was so confusing. But very soon, a beautiful female voice called him. 3 gorgeous French women, his acquaintances, approached Charlie with a graceful gait. All the hotel guests could not help but notice such spectacular girls. Seeing them, Ross tensed up, because now, it's time for Steven to come out. You look great, Michelle said to him. Cecile and Cindy began to compliment the young man's figure and good taste. And at that moment, Darren just walked past them. He watched his comrade and the ladies closely. The commander, without showing it, shook his head, which meant, wait nearby. Darren understood him and nodded in response. Michelle noticed that Charlie was looking away and brought his attention back to her. You're upsetting me again, she said. And the young man only awkwardly apologized. He asked the girls to speak in turn, as he was a little distracted by this. The 3 girls looked at him and Michelle said, Okay, Charlie. Then the first question, the girl continued and asked coquettishly, What are your plans for today? The student suggested changing the location first. The 4 of them walked past Darren, who was pretending to be on his phone. But as soon as they passed, he continued to follow. Charlie just looked back to check on his comrade. They went to the restaurant and very soon several dishes were brought to their table. We haven't ordered anything yet, Ross explained. The waiter said that he was ordered to serve them at the highest level, and this is a compliment from the establishment. The brunette didn't expect this, so he was surprised. They were told that the best dishes of our restaurant would be served, and if they needed anything else, they could call a waiter at any time. The student began to wave his hand, saying that he understood everything. Michelle took advantage of the moment to ask for a wine list, and soon the waiter left the guests for a while. Wow, Charlie, you're a big deal, aren't you? The red-haired girl asked coquettishly. The guy admitted that he is not one of them, he just has one acquaintance. Michelle looked at the young man with a very interested look. He seemed more and more mysterious to her. But for Ross himself, it was completely inconvenient that the bandits were doing unnecessary things. And here is the long-awaited clink of glasses, but one of them is without alcohol. Charlie, don't you like alcohol? Michelle asked. The young man reminded that he is still a schoolboy, although inside he is almost 30. The Frenchwoman did not expect that he led a healthy lifestyle. Cindy admired the taste of the wine, saying that it was difficult to try something like this even in France. Michelle also decided to try the taste. There was harmony at the table, the girls were laughing. Ross looked at them. They were all 26 years old. They were all from mixed families and lived in the same area, so they were close. Michelle works as a magazine editor. Cecile is an employee of the company. Well, Cindy is a freelancer. Charlie couldn't believe that he was sitting there in this situation, calmly chatting with them. Suddenly, the phone in the young man's pocket rang. Charlie apologized to the girls and said he needed to answer. They fell silent with understanding and watched the guy. However, the unexpected call greatly confused the young man, because Darren would not have called, but sent a message so as not to attract unnecessary attention. When Ross saw who was calling him, it turned out to be Guantak himself. The young man decided to pick up the phone and became a little tense. You're at the Namsan Hotel now, and you've even dressed up, the bandit asked mockingly, but the student immediately said that it didn't concern him. Hey, maybe stop being so harsh. I actually want to get closer to you. If you need anything, you can tell. So, Dosuk, as long as it's not something serious, this brat can handle it, Guantak explained. The brunette didn't need this dialogue at all, so he quickly hung up. Michelle noticed that the guy was acting a bit strange today. It seems you have some other things to do. Don't try to deceive a woman's intuition, she said. The young man thought that nothing terrible would happen if he told them some part. Of course, he was not going to tell them everything. Charlie admitted, Okay, you caught me. In fact, there is an American named Steven staying at this hotel. Perhaps he will join our feast, he continued. The girl was unhappy. Did Ross really invite them here just for this? He didn't try to hide it, and replied that to some extent she was right. The girl looked at the guy sympathetically. She was worried that this was connected with that problem at home. It may not be directly related, but there are some things I would like to personally check. And in the end, I feel guilty towards you, Charlie said. After hearing this, Michelle became thoughtful. Cecile and Cindy exchanged glances. The brunette felt awkward, but he waited for an answer from them. The girl thought for some time without saying anything, and at some point she looked at the student and said, Since you told the truth and even apologized, then I will forgive you this time. Cecile and Cindy looked at each other again, but this time with approval. Cecile said in a friendly manner that it would be even more interesting with 5 of us. Ross thanked the girls for their kindness. The girl lightened the mood by saying that if they had one more person, it would be just right. Meanwhile, a message arrived on the commander's phone. Ken Evans finally wrote to him to say that Steven had arrived. The young man wanted to head to the club, but the man stopped him. The next message came with the following content: Serpents venimeux. The boy knew that this phrase meant poisonous snakes. He remembered that it was a French group, and at that moment, horror appeared on his face. Darren was just now watching these people. He saw tattoos on their arms with a special mark of this group. There were 3 of them, but there could be more. The poisonous snakes have tattoos of a red snake just under their thumb. Darren had a run-in with them in Paris before, so he couldn't be mistaken. But why are they here? Did Sharan and Steven hire them as bodyguards? Darren asked to finish for today because they didn't take into account the gangsters. There was some sense in his words, but even if they postponed everything until tomorrow, it didn't mean the group would disappear. Moreover, tomorrow we might have to fight with Sharan too. The guy was angry and clenched his teeth, exhaling in disappointment. But when does anything ever go according to plan? In the end, Charlie decided to act as they had decided. Of course, Darren was alarmed by such a choice, but nothing could be done, and he warned that the company was going to a club. Ross was irritated by this because they didn't even give him time to think. Meanwhile, a group of 4 people, led by Steven, went down to the club. A tense atmosphere developed at the table. Everyone was silent and looked at each other for a bit. Now, Charlie needed to calm down and think. What is most beneficial for him now, and what is not beneficial? Ross remained in this state for some time. Soon So Dosok, whom the young man had called, approached their table. The guy announced that 4 foreigners were coming to the club and asked if the manager could take all the guests out and hold them outside after he entered. The brunette also warned that they might have to close until tomorrow. So Dosuk explained that it is not within his competence to resolve such issues. Therefore, he suggested discussing this not with him, but with Mr. Guantok. Charlie immediately called Lee Guantaik. The first thing he did was order the local club to be closed for today. The bandit did not understand why the guy suddenly dared to speak to him in such a tone. The girls at the table felt uncomfortable, and Ross only repeated that there was no time at all. Guantak admitted that he only owns part of it, so there could be problems since there are other owners. But the young man did not back down and offered a deal. If you help me now, I promise to fulfill any request of yours in the future, so today, do as I ask. The man was confused. He was thinking about what to do. But the guy didn't have time to wait, and he shouted his name into the phone. Any request, you say? He asked with interest, and Charlie in turn handed the phone to So Dosok. The manager only confirmed that the young man was saying to let in only 4 foreigners and close the doors. Finally, the man said, "Yes, it will be done," and he handed the phone back into Ross's hands. Guantak explained that he had ordered them to do as the student had asked, and in case something went wrong, he had asked them to take a couple of his guys with them. So Dosuk and one of ours are already there, so take them first. Within 30 minutes, a few more guys we are close with will arrive. The bandit continued. If Guantak's guys can hold off those Frenchmen for at least a little while, then their chances will be better. But Charlie couldn't, because there was one but. So he said it wasn't worth it and just asked to close the doors. The young man thanked him and disconnected from the conversation. Michelle was worried. She saw that something had happened. Ross honestly admitted that there were poisonous snakes in this hotel, a gang of which the girls knew about. He apologized to the frightened French women because he didn't think that everything would go so far, and warned, "For now everything is fine, so just stay here quietly, and when the opportunity arises, leave." Michelle turned him down, saying they could help. "What can you do with such a scared face?" he asked her. She remained silent, confused, not knowing what to answer. "Besides, you'll have to go back to France someday, and you might get into trouble if you were caught by them while you were near me," Ross explained. The young man stood up from the table and said that he would go first. He left his worried friends and promised to call later. Charlie ordered Soda Syuk to take care of the 3, and also do what he asked as soon as possible. The manager assured that there was no need to worry. Thus, the commander left the restaurant in a hurry. The die is cast, but what happens now? Life at the hotel went on as usual. Meanwhile, Charlie met with Darren. They needed to turn off the snakes first, so they went to the club. They will use the element of surprise and knock out 2 of them, 1 for each. Darren was worried about leaving his tools in the car, but Ross reassured him that there would still be plenty of items inside that could be used as weapons. "What if they have a firearm with them?" the man suddenly asked. "This is Korea," the guy explained. "They would only bring guns with them if they knew who we really are, At this time, several dissatisfied girls were leaving the club. No, how can they suddenly kick them out like that? Are they crazy? What club behaves like that? The indignation reached the ears of the guys. All this was happening thanks to Guantok, so Charlie was grateful to him. And finally, they entered the club. Ross noticed that there weren't that many customers here, perhaps because it was still early, but that was even better. Looking around, Darren quickly found those they needed. Not far from them, at a round table, sat a group of poisonous snakes and Steven. Charlie saw them too and told them not to rush. At this time, the blonde was calmly drinking alcohol, surrounded by bodyguards. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed figures approaching him. Charlie and Steven greeted each other in a friendly manner. The man said that they had a little time left and he decided to cool his head a little. "By the way, you said you'd be with beauties?" the blonde asked incredulously. Ross asked not to worry because he had just called them, so they would be here soon. "Oh, really? Then how about having a light drink with me first?" the man asked. The student asked modestly if he would disturb, to which he replied that it was not in their relationship, and Steven patted the sofa. The brunette understood that the man was just playing and that it was all clearly because of the girls. Charlie took the bottle, saying, "Then I'll be grateful to have a bottle." And at that moment, the blonde decided to ask who the man was next to the guy. "How can I explain it? Let's say he is the one who introduced me to those girls. You can call him Mr. Juice," the student answered. Steven laughed and said he understood the guys. He was glad to meet Mr. Juice, so he handed him the bottle as a sign of friendship. Darren looked at the alcohol being handed to him with distrust for a moment, but soon he took it from the blonde's hands. Steven smiled strangely and sat down. The man began drinking his alcohol again. Meanwhile, the club's guests were actively leaving the place. Suddenly, Steven says, "By the way, I'm a little disappointed. I heard that Koreans like to dance and drink, but it's pretty boring here. Even the few who were here have already left." Charlie laughed, explaining that it was too early. And at that moment, when the last people left, the brunette grabbed the neck of the bottle and announced that now was the time to surprise you. One of the bodyguards started looking around and saying that something was wrong. Charlie and Darren immediately attacked the bandits. Steven was frightened by such an unexpected attack. As agreed, they immediately knocked out two of them, but the blonde one decided to run away, climbing over the sofa. The poisonous snakes tried to somehow resist their opponents. Well, Steven fell off the sofa and started crawling further. When he turned back, he was horrified. Charlie stood on top of the bloody bandit, stabbed with bottle shards. The blonde began to leave the club in a hurry. Charlie saw this and also noticed something else out of the corner of his eye. Darren, who was at that moment dealing with one of the bodyguards, was attacked from behind by another one. The menacing man with a scar on his face had already raised the bottle above his head, but it immediately breaks when something hits it. This was just the chance to catch up with Steven, so Darren rushed after him. He ran up and jumped at him. The blonde man who was trying to escape noticed this, but he didn't have time to dodge and fell together with Darren. The teacher got on top and began to pin Steven to the floor while he tried to break free, after which a barrage of blows immediately fell upon him, which he tried to block with his hands. Charlie was also actively fighting another opponent. The man with the scar tried to block and dodge the blows, but at one point he missed and was hit in the face with full force. Having flown back a little, he still remained on his feet. But then the snake reached into his jacket pocket. Charlie was afraid that the bandit would now take out the pistol that he had taken with him, and when the enemy pulled out his hand, there was a knife in it. Ross was glad it wasn't a gun, but the man had a strange posture as if he didn't know how to handle a knife. The next moment, the bandit was already flying towards the guy with his blade pointed. Fortunately, the commander managed to dodge and not get hurt, and the opponent thereby opened himself up and received a serious blow to the face. Ross took the big guy by the arm and shoulder, and in this grip he began to kick him in the stomach. He grabbed his hands to incapacitate them, after which he began to twist his hand with the weapon, and the man fell to the floor, still in Charlie's grip. He begged to stop, knowing what would happen next. However, the brunette did not spare him, and literally a moment later a loud crunch was heard in his hand. The bandit remained unconscious. Charlie dealt with these three quite easily. Ross turned towards the last one remaining, but what he saw shocked him. Steven held Darren's head in a death grip. Unfortunately, the young man began to rejoice too early. "You hardly did it because of the contract," the blonde asked angrily. Here, Charlie saw a special movement of Steven's neck when he was confident in the outcome of the fight. So first, it was necessary to break his spirit. The young man turned to him. "Don't you even know my name?" "Of course I know," Steven said sternly. "How did you survive? Did you betray your guys?" Charlie started asking questions. The blonde didn't understand what the student was talking about. "You still don't get it, do you?" Ross asked, explaining that Steven was currently holding Darren. The man, perplexed, began to ask who the guy was. "I just can't get it. I'm Charlie Ross," the boy told him. The confusion and fear in Steven's eyes only grew, and the commander continued. "Charlie Ross, whom you begged for mercy. Charlie Ross, who beat you half to death when you decided to do something wild in the middle of a fight." Steven looked at the brunette in horror. Standing before him was the god of Blackfield himself, Charlie Ross. He remembered trying to justify himself by saying that he had not harassed the girl from the settlement. How he received a powerful blow as punishment for such behavior. I remembered the anger of the commander who knew he was lying, and how the wounded man communicated with Charlie for the last time. "Who am I?" The question sounded in my head, and immediately the answer came. "God of Blackfield." Steven began to panic because what Charlie said was impossible. "Apparently, those who died undeservedly pushed me to make sure I dealt with the traitor," Ross explained. The blonde man started to get hysterical because he said he didn't want to go to Korea. But seeing a serious-minded student in front of me, he came to his senses and asked, "I don't know how it happened, but it looks like you don't have the body of the god of Blackfield?" The man realized that he shouldn't be afraid of such a weakling. At this moment, Charlie became very tense, but he still challenged him and said, "If you are so interested, come and check." However, Steven had Darren in his grasp, so he was confident that Ross would not attack him, since he could break his neck at any moment. Did working for the company really give him some brains? The guy thought disappointedly. Meanwhile, Darren woke up and began to groan loudly. Hearing this, Charlie was scared out of his mind because he needed to give his comrade a quiet signal if he woke up. At that very second, Steven immediately snaps Darren's neck, realizing that he is conscious. Charlie instantly jumped up from his seat and ran towards Steven. He jumped and hit the blonde in the eye with all his might. The man screamed in pain and his face became distorted. He loosened his grip, holding onto the place where he had been struck, and Darren fell to the floor. Ross pierced the traitor with a murderous look. He, trembling with anger and pain, bared his teeth at him. "Well, I'll be damned. Before your blow would drive me crazy with pain, but now it just stings a little." Steven chuckled sarcastically. The young man understood that he would not be able to knock him out with one blow because he did not have enough strength and speed. The blonde took off his jacket and began to roll up his sleeves for a serious fight. And immediately after that, he attacked the guy screaming. He flew over Charlie, raising his fist above him. But the brunette turned out to be quicker and managed to hit his opponent in the jaw. Blood and saliva sprayed from his mouth. Steven tried to attack the student again, but the boy successfully dodged. The young man's movements were precise and his gaze stern. He quickly turned to face the man, and he struck at him, but the blonde blocked it. A series of blows rained down on the thug's body. Steven steadfastly endured the pain from the blows, of which there were an endless number. And finally, he chose the moment and decided to strike back. It hit Ross right in the arm. The force of his blows seemed to bend the guy's arm, and Charlie even flew back but still remained on his feet. The commander reasoned. "Out of 2 blows, only one reaches the target. This won't do. There's nothing left to do but strike at his weak spot." Steven laughed loudly and quipped, "You are very different from the god of Blackfield that I knew." The young man, running up to the man again, dodged the approaching fist. At chest level, he tried to strike. Now was the perfect moment to attack. But a powerful blow to the side from Steven disrupted his plans. The guy winced in pain, sweat running down his face. "It won't work," the opponent confidently declared. Ross bared his teeth. He knew that if he hit, his opponent would be in trouble. And the guy delivers the next blow to his impudent face, and using the chance from the second hand adds damage. Steven, bleeding, looks at Charlie with hatred in his eyes. He quickly gets his bearings and punches the young man in the stomach. Hellish pain pierces his body. His eyes widen even more. Ross responds furiously by punching him in the face again. Charlie's next blow lands on his right hand. The brunette is not going to give in and once again hits him in the jaw. Both opponents are heated to the limit. They are ready to tear each other apart. Steven decides to kick the commander in the right side. Contorted in agony, the boy tries to endure the pain again. Charlie hits the traitor with such a powerful blow that he almost falls. Steven stood with his hands in a block, breathing heavily. The young man took all his hatred and anger into his fist to strike this bastard with all his might, and immediately punches him in the stomach. The body is shaking. Blood and saliva are flowing from Steven's mouth. The blow left a dent in the man's body. However, this is not the end. Ross has picked up speed. He ran up to the blonde and jumped onto his half-bent legs, and pushing off from them, the guy hits them in the jaw with his knee. More blood gushed down Steven's face. He was in terrible pain. And then Ross followed up with an elbow attack to the head from above. The brunette jumped off his opponent and he began to stagger. The traitor closed his eyes, stood up again and covered himself with his hands. Charlie sees that his opponent is still on his feet and gets angry. He lifts his leg up and knocks his head off. From this attack, Steven finally loses his balance and falls. The bully hits his head hard on the floor. While the blonde lay motionless, Charlie tried to catch his breath. Afterwards, he began to approach his opponent. The young man grabbed him by the shirt, but the man himself could barely breathe. Steven ran out of strength and said, "Damn, this weakling again." The young man stood over him and raised his fist to end the fight. And with quick, precise blows, the student continued to finish off the enemy. Now blood began to flow from the eye of the lying blonde. It was then that Charlie realized that there was one blow left. Steven looked at his former commander in horror. He screamed furiously throughout the club. In a panic, the man began to shake his head and scream. And to calm him down, the young man shook him by the shirt several times so hard that the blonde's head hit the floor hard. And finally, Steven's body could no longer move. His face was covered in blood, tears, and saliva, and he was trembling. And Charlie stood up and, holding his side, walked away. The young man approached the exit of the club, his whole body aching. He started knocking on the door and calling for So Do-sok to open the door. And a few moments later, the manager came out to the guy with several bandits. The first thing Ross did was order Ken Evans to be taken to the hospital, and the bandits immediately rushed towards him. So Do-sok asked if the young man was okay, and the guy only asked him not to react so sharply. And seeing a bat in his hands, he borrowed it for himself. Bleeding and in pain, the two bodyguards lay on the sofa. One of them tensed up greatly when he saw who approached him. It was Charlie, who was already swinging his arm to finish them off. He hit one of them on the knee with all his might. Again and again he struck, blood spraying in all directions. Both bandits groaned in pain, but Ross continued. And when the men were already exhausted and their bodies were shaking involuntarily, the young man stopped, reminding them that they were in Korea. And after that, he left these bandits. Now the brunette picked up the broken bottle from the floor, and he headed towards Steven, who was suffering from pain. "I won't kill you. I'll even send you to the hospital. But in the future, you won't be able to do what you love so much anymore," he said, leaning over the blonde. With all his might, he tried to explain that it was Sharon who had sold them. But it was too late for confessions, because the sharp edges of the broken bottle were already raised above his body. However, here he says something interesting. Diamonds, drugs. He wants to use Ross U motors. Charlie, perplexed, began to shake him to make him repeat what he had said. One of So Do-sok's bandits saw the atmosphere between Steven and Charlie change and wondered what was going on. Meanwhile, the blonde man said that the drugs were being sent along with the cars, but Charlie understood that this didn't add up because they wanted to give the contract to Sojung Motors. "We were going to agree to terms with 50 units, according to the plan. In each order of Ross U, they should hide drugs," admitted Steven. Charlie didn't know what kind of nonsense he was talking about, but he was sure of one thing. If this was true, then these two could harm his father. And even after he deals with them, he will have to sweat. After this, the young man brutally thrust the bottle into the man's shoulder. Of course, when he lifted her up, some of the fragments remained in her body. Ross saw that she was already broken. He even felt sorry that this bastard was so strong. While the young man was dealing with the traitor, the bandits were searching the wounded. And as it turned out, one of the snakes had a very good knife. Charlie noticed what the man had found and ordered it to be given to him. The bandit handed the gentleman a knife in a case, and now he swung it at Steven. He began to cut his hands, the left one for Darren, the right one for Charlie. The rest could only watch the blonde's torture. Soon the moment came when Ross had had his fill and wiped the blood from his face. He stood up and asked to take Steven to the hospital. "There is no need to worry about them, sir. You must go to the hospital yourself. The car is waiting. We need to go." The manager addressed the young man. The guy looked at him sternly and nodded. After a while, the black minibus was already on its way, and sometime later the wounded were already being dragged to the hospital, and a doctor was meeting them. Meanwhile, the doctor was observing the arrivals. Charlie decided to ask, "Ken Evans arrived first. How is he?" "Time will tell," the doctor replied, which meant that Darren was still alive. The man in glasses explained that first they needed to take an X-ray and take some medication, after which they would talk. And a little later, the nurse was already treating the wounds. Charlie asked her to untie the bandages on her right hand. "By the way, what is your boss's name?" he asked. But the girl didn't have time to answer, because the voice in the office sounded, "Yu Hong." A doctor came in and introduced himself. "Chongan, I'll sort this out. You can go," he commanded the nurse. The doctor invited the young man to go into another office. "Of course, I told you that you can come here anytime, but don't you think that you've come back too soon?" So Hongwoo asked, but Ross himself understood this perfectly well, and just at that moment Charlie's chest x-ray arrived. It became clear that 3 left ribs were on the verge of fracture and his insides were at their limit. The doctor was indignant that at such a moment the guy was only interested in his name. "You just didn't introduce yourself," the brunette replied. The doctor suggested postponing this because the guy needs to go to treatment, because if he lets things slide, the ribs could break and puncture the internal organs. However, the commander refused, saying that he could not do it now, so he only asked to bandage him. "I'm telling you, your ribs could break. Maybe some parts have already damaged your organs. Is there a simpler way to explain it?" Honu said with displeasure. If Charlie doesn't get the treatment he needs now, he could die. But he offered, "Then you can take all my organs out and sell them. We already agreed." The doctor admitted that he would not sell anything in such a deplorable state. Who would need organs that were torn here and there? The man began to get angry, asking to explain the reason for refusing treatment. The young man did not hide the fact that if he went to hospital now, several people would be in danger. He was afraid for his family, comrades, and other acquaintances. Seo Hong-woo exhaled and said sternly, "Then I will prescribe you painkillers and give you the strongest rib brace. Do not take it off under any circumstances and come back here as soon as you solve your problems." Of course, Charlie understood the doctor. "I hope I clearly said no way, and don't take it off. This is not a request or an instruction. This is an order," the doctor explained. Soon Ross put on the retainer and got dressed. He left the doctor's office and went out into the corridor. A bandit ran towards him, worried. "Sir, is everything okay?" "Still like me, like Ken Evans," the young man clarified. The manager pointed to a door nearby, saying that Ken was lying there. The commander went inside and stood next to the bed. He said languidly, "You need to be able to retreat if you feel that you don't have enough strength." Charlie looked at his stupid and desperate comrade and thanked him. The guy assured that he would finish all this himself, and until then he asked Darren to have a good rest. Ross soon left the room in a state of anger. His brows furrowed, his jaw clenched. The young man was angry. There were bandits standing in his way, guarding another chamber, and they first took up a fighting stance when they saw the approaching figure. But realizing that it was Mr. Charlie, they immediately bowed respectfully to him. The guy opened the door to the room and walked in. 4 completely bandaged people lay on the beds. One of the snakes smiled, looking at the brunette. He admitted that he had let his guard down this time, but now said that Ross's family was in trouble. The commander ran into the impudent big guy. Did he really dare to threaten him? The bandit began to put his finger to his head, simulating a shot and death. After the fight, these bastards still had some fire in them. Looks like Charlie will have to teach them a lesson. The young man called to 2 guards outside the room, and he asked to bring the thing that he had brought with him. They immediately understood what was going on, and one of them ran to the van. The guy turned back to the impudent bandit, who was already showing him the middle finger. Soon Ross was called by the bandits from the corridor. The man quickly ran for the dagger and gave it to Charlie. He was sweating profusely from being in such a hurry, and the student took the blade from him. He asked them to wait outside. It is not surprising that the bandits did not calm down. Because Ross only scratched them a couple of times with glass, he, of course, will be ashamed in front of Yu Hong, but he will have to do it for the common good. Charlie showed the bastard what they found on him. The bandit began to panic and ask what the young man was going to do with him, to which Ross reassured him that the man would still be able to breathe. "And you don't care if your whole family goes bankrupt?" he asked. But the commander had already raised his blade higher, causing cries of horror. The thug started to say that they were foreigners who had come here to set up business. "If you do this." But the guy interrupted him, replying, "You will make such speeches at the embassy." And after these words, the blade plunges into the man's body. A cutting pain pierces the wounded man's body, and he writhes all over. The man, gritting his teeth, asked them to stop. And very quickly, tears began to flow from his eyes and he begged for salvation. The whole bed was now stained with blood. Now Charlie headed towards Stephen, who was already shouting at him to stay away. The commander came closer and closer, and the fear in the blonde's eyes grew. And then the young man raised the blade over him, and the traitor began to scream, calling for help. And so, covered in wounds, he begged not to do it. The guards standing behind the door watched what was happening through a small window. They were shocked by what Charlie was doing. At some point, they couldn't take it anymore and moved away from the window when the screams became unbearable. However, after a while, the noise stopped and they listened. At that moment, Ross was just leaving the room. The guy was quite frightened by the unexpected appearance of the men. He stood and stared at one point. His thoughts were not here. Here he finally decided to ask for something. 3 people. "Move them to another room," he continued, and after some time, on his orders, the bandits transported them. Charlie watched this closely and waited until the bed with the last one left the ward. Now he and Stephen were left alone. Because the blonde's eyes were bandaged, he couldn't see anything and only heard the commander approaching him, which scared him to the point of insanity. "You finished with me? You did everything. You said you wouldn't kill me. I won't kill you, but it just pisses me off that you can calmly walk on this earth with your own feet," the young man said with hatred. In fear, Stephen began to justify himself by saying that he knew nothing and recalled that he was the first to be wounded. He shouted loudly that Sharan had come and the man was still alive when he brought the rescue team, thinking that they were all dead. "Then why are you still licking his ass? You know that this freak betrayed us," the guy objected. It turned out that it was all about the diamonds. Because of them, Sharan decided to sell the team. Even knowing the truth, Stephen had no other choice according to him. "What could I do to gangsters with a bullet in the stomach? I just wanted to live a little longer," the blonde admitted. An angry Charlie explained that he should have told everything at least in the hospital, or that he decided to join the bastard. And with all his cruelty, the commander plunged a knife into his thigh, saying, "Since he gave you a share?" Gritting his teeth, the man arched his back and howled in pain. Continuing to wound him, the guy asked, "How many more people arrived with Sharan?" Writhing in pain, the man screamed, Two! Ross then turned the gun in the wound and asked if they were armed. Sobbing furiously, the blonde confessed, "A fourth-generation Glock 19. The young man abruptly pulled the knife out of his body. The blonde man was sweating and breathing heavily, enduring the pain. The guy thought, they were armed after all. Well, that's not surprising, since the original plan was not to sell cars, but to smuggle them. That is, if they had backed down, the next time they would have had to face these bastards, but this time with a firearm. After these thoughts, at the same second, with all his cruelty, Ross struck the second leg. The entire ward was filled with cries of pain. The white sheet quickly became stained with blood rapidly gushing from the wounds. The brunette walked away and threw the weapon on the floor. He knew he had to end this before word got back to Sharan. No matter how badass they are, they're unlikely to be firing guns in Korea's best hotel. That would attract too much media attention. Before leaving the room, the young man's path is blocked by Yu Hong, who opened the door. He began shouting at Mr. Ross in anger. "This is a hospital," he declared and continued. "If you do this in the hospital, I won't be able to treat you." Charlie immediately explained that these were members of the most brutal groups in France, and as soon as they recovered, they would be able to kill everyone, from the sick and nurses to the doctor himself, and asked, "Do you want me to leave everything as it is?" Hanu frowned and continued to look sternly at the young man. The brunette reminded that he did not kill and did not die himself, so he did not violate their agreement. "But if you don't want to, then I won't come to this hospital anymore," he said. They looked at each other for a while and soon the doctor asked if there were any left. Ross said there were 3 more, and they were armed. The doctor smiled and said, "How can I lose such a wonderful patient whose cases are not covered by insurance? No need to change hospital. I will wait for you." The tension between them eased and the guy breathed a sigh of relief. Honu and the nurse rushed into the room to take Stephen to the emergency room, and Charlie, in turn, went out and walked thoughtfully down the corridor. He held the wound site and thought, while Ken Evans is in this state, it will be difficult to get to the hotel. I'm a schoolboy who will drive the car. A bus or taxi was not suitable as there was little maneuverability. In such a situation, he didn't want to ask Ogwantak for help anymore. Be that as it may, even if the young man arrives at the hotel, how can he get Sharan out? After all, this bastard is not as simple as Stephen. Even if he didn't know everything yet, he should have already had suspicions. Charlie was sure of it. Even if the guy had invaded his room or called him to some quiet place, it would still not have been clear how to resist him and his thugs because they have weapons. And the commander's body is now in such a state that it could fall apart if you touch it with one finger. It was a complete failure. There was nothing that could have played into his hands. In any case, we need to sort this out now. But at that moment, the guy stopped and thought about the wording right now. Is this really a case where you need to act now? Charlie thought about it and decided to think about it again. Shahran tied 3 thugs to guard Stephen, who simply went down to the club to pick up girls. There are no weapons in this country, and Shahran certainly couldn't have known about him or Darren. Was there really a need to protect such a strong guy like Stephen? And then Ross realized that it might not have been security. And those people who were with the blonde acted as surveillance. Perhaps Stephen knows some secret or weak spot of Shahran's, in which case it is not Ross who needs to hurry. Confidence and seriousness appeared in the guy's eyes. After all, it was Shahran who should be nervous and going crazy now. At this time, in the ward, the doctor and nurse were treating Stephen's wounds. The door that suddenly opened scared them quite a bit. "What else?" the doctor asked irritably. Charlie replied that nothing special and asked if he spoke French. The man admitted that he only spoke a little English. and Charlie asked him to continue doing his job for him, ignoring the young man, since he wanted to talk to the patient. The commander addressed Stephen in French. He, in anger and confusion, began to question him. "Why did you come again? Did you decide to kill me after all?" The guy continued, "Where will the money from the sale of diamonds go?" Immediately after this question, the blonde tensed up and fell silent. Ross sternly remarked, "If you want to pull your tricks on me, well, try it. But it won't work," he immediately declared, grabbing the blonde by the jaw. He squeezed her hard and started threatening that this time he would actually kill him. Stephen asked whether the people in the room could be trusted. Charlie explained that they didn't understand French, so he didn't have to worry about the conversation. The blonde, trusting the young man, told him about the Swiss bank. "Then why did he leave you alive?" The commander was puzzled. This is not so much in Sharan's character, after which Stephen answered, "The password to the account." And he continued, "We divided it, half with me, half with Sharan, so if I die, he won't be able to get the money." His words made sense, but Stephen himself couldn't figure it out. But Charlie knew this bastard, so he gave him a final warning, ordering him to speak without tricks and only the truth, after which he asked, "Why did Sharan save you?" "I have no idea. Sharan came to the hospital and did this. Said not to open your mouth. There are about 10 million euros, the blonde admitted. If converted to one, it would be more than 10 billion. Are these diamonds really the size of a head, or? The guy decided to clarify, "Are these blackheads?" Cuffed in Charlie's arms, Stephen answered honestly that it was them. Rare stones that are found in Africa once every 10 years. It is also called the Devil's Stone. Charlie himself had never seen them in real life, but now it became clear why Sharan went crazy over them. "And what about drugs?" the commander clarified. As it turned out, Sharan was only taking them for testing. Be that as it may, now we have to deal with drugs too. When asked who the buyer was, Stephen, begging for mercy, replied that he did not know. In a situation like this, he couldn't trust Stephen 100%, but it didn't seem like he was lying. The last question Charlie asked was, "What is the password for the account?" But before Stephen began to answer, he asked the doctor to shout a little. "Just start shouting any phrases as if you were angry," the young man asked. And at that very second, the doctor starts yelling at Ross, "What did you say? Do you want me to get angry at you? Do you think I'm just going to start yelling at your request?" He started raising his voice. "Nurse Kim, how about we have some butter-jjigae for dinner?" The blonde didn't understand why the doctor started shouting. Was it really because Charlie said he would beat me? Ross joined in the shouting, declaring that tonkatsu were better than butter-jjigae. The guy knew that it was definitely not about money, at least not in such amounts that would make Sharan shut his mouth. However, there is no better bait for this puppy than this. After shouting in Korean, Ross turned to Stephen in French. Last time, password. The blonde was scared to death and was trying to decide what to do. But eventually, he gave in and said, "Smithen, 0702 of 0913 Africa." When the guy heard the whole password, he became very angry. Meanwhile, Guantak's bandits were standing in the corridor. Soon Charlie himself came out to them. He was serious because the fight had already begun, and he had to win in any case. The young man put his hand in his pocket to get his phone. But it wasn't there, just like in the other pocket. Did it really fall out during the fight at the hotel? All this irritated Ross to no end. He ordered the bandit to connect him with Guantak. The manager took out his phone and dialed the required number. He said, "Mr. Charlie Ross asked me to call you." "Yes, I'm passing the phone on." He obediently handed the phone over to the guy's bloody hands. Charlie began to quickly move away from prying ears to talk to him. Guantak asked, "What do you want? And by the way, do you know how to speak a foreign language?" But Ross ignored this and immediately warned that there were drug samples in the Namsan hotel. "What?" the man exclaimed, puzzled. The brunette only now realized that he had rushed with this news. "Oh, Guantak is the head of the gangs. Maybe he is the buyer." The young man turned towards the bandits and looked at them. In that case, these guys will quickly stop being so friendly. Enraged, Guantak started yelling into the phone, "Tell me straight, are there drugs in Namsan?" Charlie calmly replied that there were samples. What difference does it make who this bastard is that he decided to do such things on someone else's territory without permission? He was indignant. "Isn't the buyer Guantak? In any case, you have to be careful," and the guy said, "According to my source, 3 Frenchmen, but that means there is also a buyer." "And he doesn't know who it is?" the man asked, and it turned out that he didn't. It was strange because in this area, if you sell any drugs, it is difficult to pass by Guantak, to which Ross replied, "Firstly, the suppliers are members of the French group Poisonous Snakes. Most likely they have firearms." The guy decided to end it today. He planned to get them out, so he asked the bandit to find a suitable place, and if they didn't show up, Charlie would go to the hotel. Guantek explained that it would be difficult to do anything at the hotel again today since they had just opened the club, so he suggested it would be better to take him outside. I have a quiet villa in Namyangju. Let's do it there. I'll help with the car, so use it. Finally, Ross warned that these Frenchmen were not so simple, so the bandits should not go first, because if they decided to attack, it would be bad. This is my game. Do you want me to hide my head in the ground? Guantok said. Keep them quiet if you need anything. Tell the boys I'll come too. The young man had a choice, a hotel or a villa. Even if he told him to stay away, he would not listen. So for now, he said that he would figure it out depending on the circumstances. The call was interrupted and the clock showed 10 hours and 8 minutes. The commander shouted to the bandit to find out the hotel number. As it turned out, he knew him, so he suggested calling him right away. He took the phone in his hands and began pressing the numbers. And soon, he handed the phone back to Mr. Ross. Charlie immediately called there and asked for the number 1901 and to connect him with Sharan. A little later, a voice sounded on the phone, but it was not Sharan's. Charlie insisted that the phone be given to Sharan, but the man explained that he could not answer the call now, so he offered to tell him the information to pass on to the man. Ross agreed and asked me to pass on something, and in the meantime, at the Namsan Hotel, Shahran was sitting at a table in a restaurant with 2 men. They were talking about their own topics. Suddenly, a subordinate approached him and distracted him. He said brazenly, "Can't you see that I'm busy? I understand, but they called the room and asked me to tell you something. I think you need to know," the man said guiltily. The subordinate approached his ear and began to whisper, "Swiss bank? Drugs? And the god of Blackfield is waiting for you," he said so. After the young man had conveyed everything, he disconnected the call. The guy called one of the bandits again. This time he asked to dial So Dosuk's number from the hotel. The man picked up the phone again and entered his contact information. There was a beep and Charlie brought the phone to his ear. On the other end of the line he heard, "What do you want, puppy?" To which the guy replied that it was Charlie Ross. He awkwardly said, "Yes, this is Mr. Sodosuk," and the young man said that among the guests there was a Frenchman named Sharan. He ordered a report on his movements, what he had just done, where he was now, and what he was doing now, as many details as possible. So Dosok said that some time ago, a man came and asked about a foreigner named Steven, and then briefly visited the club as soon as it opened. Now he is in a restaurant with Korean guests, and judging by the talk, these are high-ranking members of the board of Sojong Motors. Ross found it strange that Sharan was meeting them at such a time. "I understand that something unusual is going to happen. Call this number immediately," the young man ordered. The guy asked if they had tidied up the club, and it turned out that everything was fine and it was working again. Brunette asked if his phone was there, but So Dosuk himself did not participate in the cleaning, but he was not informed about this, after which Ross said that he had one more request. Since Shahran was still in the restaurant, the commander asked to check his room, in case something interesting came up. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this," the manager said with annoyance. "And even if Mr. Guantak gives the order, the man will not be able to, because their position does not allow this." Charlie agreed and in that case asked to simply keep an eye on Sharan and report if he returned to the room. Ross thought, "There is something suspicious, but Steven did not seem to lie. But this is not surprising. Knowing the whole situation and my character, he is unlikely to decide to deceive me." Meanwhile, at the hotel, a subordinate told Sharan that the god of Blackfield was waiting for him. The man became very tense after hearing the news, but he immediately pulled himself together and calmly said, "I understand. Wait a little." He turned to the people opposite. "I'm very sorry, but there is a matter coming from the head office that requires immediate attention." They were understanding about the situation and said that there was nothing to worry about, especially since they had already discussed everything that was necessary. So Sharan could go calmly. The parties said goodbye to each other, and the man and his subordinate left. They passed by one of the hotel workers. As soon as he saw them, he called the manager, and Sharan walked quickly and worried, "The god of Blackfield? Could it really be Steven?" In the meantime, Charlie stood in the hospital corridor and waited. At some point, a bandit approached him, and he handed over the phone, and it turned out that it was Dosuk's brother calling. It turned out that Sharan had gone up to his room. The manager asked again about the young man's phone number, but no one had seen it. After that, they said goodbye, and Charlie ended the call. He stood anxiously, leaning against the wall. In such a situation, he really missed a cigarette. It was 10:30. Considering the time in the elevator, he should have already been in his room. So Ross dialed his number and called. The voice on the other end of the line said, "Hello," and Charlie introduced himself. I think you have something to say. That's why I'm calling, but if not, I'll hang up, the young man said. You must have heard something from Stephen. Don't be stupid, Sharan began to threaten. Ross asked if he should hang up, and then the man offered that if the guy would tell him where Stephen was, he would give them a monopoly and said, "That's it, and you're out." Charlie didn't understand what Sharan was talking about, but after thinking for a bit, the guy realized that Sharan thought that Stephen had abandoned him, of course. Who in their right mind would think that a man who died several years ago in Africa was alive again? So it was time to play by his rules, and Charlie said, Ross U Motors can't keep the contract. Sharan assured that everything would be in a clean form, as for the delivery of 50 units, so he asked to give the location. But the young man immediately explained that no promises were needed, and they would sign an agreement. Look at this bastard, this behavior really angered the man. To be honest, you don't really seem like a person worth trusting, do you? The brunette remarked sarcastically. Shahran cleared his throat a little, and it seemed to him that his tie was starting to choke him. So he began to stretch it and said, Son, I admit, your head works fine. But there is an organization involved here whose power you cannot even imagine, so stop being soft and tell me where Stephen is now. But Ross didn't care. First there was a contract, and if the man continued to talk nonsense, the young man began to threaten that the blonde would disappear forever. Before signing the contract, I would like to know what guarantees there are for Stephen's safety, Sharan asked. To which the guy replied, this should only worry you. There seems to be a lot of money in the account. Shahran explained that he has discretionary rights, but signing the contract and having it notarized will take some time. Really? Charlie remarked. Well then, there's nothing left to do but hold hands and go down together. Shahran was furious at the puppy's impudence. The young man suggested doing without the stupid excuses in his style. The enraged man couldn't stand it any longer and said, You really are a copy of the Charlie Ross I knew. He didn't need to know everything yet, so the guy suggested they stop chatting and talk business. Sharan asked if he was with Stephen, to which Charlie replied, I don't even know. Swiss bank? Drugs? Blackheads? Is there anyone else who can tell me this? After these words, Shahran immediately suggested meeting tomorrow at 10 in the business center of the Namsan Hotel, where they would sign the agreement. At that moment, Ross realized something. If Sharan suddenly starts following his father, then his mother will also be in danger. But now he has no choice but to agree with his proposal and end it. Sharan hung up the phone with all his might and anger. He screamed throughout the room, You bastard puppy! The man gritted his teeth and said, He doesn't even know how scary the world can be. This young man reminded him a lot of the previous bastard. Meanwhile, Charlie was thinking, Sharan is not like Stephen. No matter how much he hurries, he will not act to his own detriment. So the guy decided to do as before. Soon the brunette was sitting in the waiting room at the hospital. Holding a glass in his hands, he sank into despair because things were going from bad to worse, and there were big problems with his body. He started drinking the contents and suddenly stopped. The clock already read 10:45. Afterwards, Charlie crushed the glass, and going to the trash can, he threw it out. The guy decided to put off tomorrow's business until tomorrow, but first he needed to call home. Since Ross had lost his phone, he asked the girl at the reception desk to call on their behalf. He was given a push-button telephone to make a call. What am I doing? Charlie thought for a second, but he immediately exhaled with a smile. The brunette felt like he was behaving just like a real schoolboy, and so he finally dialed the number and got through to the family. Instantly, a ton of questions started pouring in about his whereabouts and why the guy wasn't answering calls. Father asked, Mom is very worried. You are already going home, aren't you? The son replied that he would be there soon. Jim calmly replied that they would have a normal talk with him at home. After the conversation, the student gave the phone back and thanked him. Charlie walked down the hospital corridor and thought. He remembered Sophia and Jim, who had already become like family to him. The way my mother came running with horror in her eyes when her son ended up in the hospital, their heart-to-heart conversation with their father late at night in the park. Ross knew he would have to go back to the hospital later, but now he had to go home. Approaching the room near which the bandits were standing, he called them. One of them ran up to him. The young man immediately said that he had one request. First, he ordered that some clothes be found for him. And when the man was about to run away to carry out the assignment, the guy stopped him. And he added, Tell Guantak and So Dosok to be at the hotel tomorrow at 10 in the morning. And if anything happens before that, let them contact me immediately. The bandit didn't understand what he was talking about, but the brunette simply insisted that his words be conveyed to them. Meanwhile, at home, the father was calming his wife, saying that his son would soon be home. He sat by her bed and worried about Sophia's condition. She, in turn, smiled tenderly and assured that everything was fine. "Do you love your son that much?" Jim asked, to which the woman asked why he was asking such a stupid question. She closed her eyes, and her husband said that everything was fine. The main thing was that Sophia would get better soon. The man's gaze dropped and he became sad. Suddenly, the silence was interrupted by a telephone ringing. At such a late hour, Secretary Kim called him. He picked up the phone and Sophia looked at him carefully. Jim listened to everything that was said to him, and suddenly he asked, "What do you mean?" He couldn't believe that they had agreed to their terms. You definitely double-checked the information with the head office in France. It couldn't be some kind of translation error, could it? Ross began to explain that it wasn't that he didn't want to, he just couldn't believe it. And they eventually agreed to meet at 10 in the morning. Okay, you did a great job, I understand," he replied. And after that, their dialogue ended. Jim turned pale and froze in shock. Sophia sat on the bed and began asking about what had happened. Having come to his senses, the man said that, on the basis of a deposit for 50 cars, they agreed to grant us a monopoly for the next 20 years. The wife was very surprised by what she heard. As it turns out, this will concern not only the Supra, but also other models of Gaunt cars. And they want to sign the contract tomorrow at 10 in the morning. When Sophia asked why everything was like this, he himself did not know the answer. But, according to them, they met with Charlie and decided to sign the contract. Jim wondered, how did this puppy do it? He didn't even know about it. And he yelled at his son to come home faster. At that moment, some sounds were heard in the hallway. The parents immediately rushed there. It was Charlie who had returned. "Sorry it's so late," the guy said with annoyance. They looked at him, completely confused. Mom ran up to him and took his hand. The woman was scared because her son's face and hands were wounded. Sophia began to ask what happened. The young man smiled and explained that nothing special had happened, as he was just training. She looked into the guy's eyes with excitement and did not let go of his hand. The father invited him to go inside, and the mother began to ask if the student had eaten. Jim didn't wait long and shared that he had received a call saying that thanks to Charlie they had received the contract. He also said that they asked him to come tomorrow at 10 to sign and asked, "How did you do it?" The brunette answered awkwardly, "It's just that some acquaintances from the internet helped." Sophia stood in front of the young man and addressed him. At that very second, she rushed to embrace her son with all the force of motherly love. Charlie looked at his mother with concern. She buried her face in the young man's chest and trembled. "Why are you crying?" he asked tenderly. She replied in tears, "I just thought how hard it was for you to deal with everything on your own." The son assured her that in fact it was his father who did everything, and he only helped. Sophia admitted that the contract is not as important to her as his health. Charlie reached behind the woman's back, and he hugged her tightly. Now he understood what family was. He buried his face in his mother's hair and enjoyed the wonderful moment. But almost immediately he pushed her away from himself, and he asked if the parents knew Ken Evans, his physical education teacher. Charlie said that he found out that he had been in a bad accident, so he wanted to visit him now. "I would like to sit with him all night," he admitted. And Sophia asked where his family was. To this, the guy replied that they seemed to be somewhere in the provinces. After these words, my father immediately said, "Go." Sophia was worried about this decision, and the brunette thanked her. But before that, he expressed a desire to go out with him, as he planned to smoke a cigarette and then go to bed. And so, after some time, the two of them were sitting on a bench in the park, and Jim was smoking. He asked, "Did you by any chance go to the bandits for help?" Charlie assured him that no, because how could people who had at most a small amount of influence in their country force a foreign company to act? The man accepted this version, but he was curious how his son did it. And he explained that excuses about the internet wouldn't work here, since he himself was in business. The original proposal was from Sharon, Mr. Sharon, the guy began, but immediately stopped, saying that he would like to tell him about it later. Father started asking why, to which Charlie replied, "Because if you keep asking, I'll have no choice but to lie, and I don't want that." Jim understood the situation and didn't press him, and he changed the subject, starting to thank his son, because thanks to him, Daddy finally won big. Charlie smiled and nodded his head, but the father warned the young man to be careful, because even if he earned billions of money but fell ill, it would be disrespectful to his parents. A little later, Charlie went to the hospital to see Darren. Having reached the required floor, he was immediately officially greeted by one of the bandits. This made the guy a little angry. "Hey, take it easy. How many times can you say hello in one day?" Then the man turned to him to tell that the teacher finally woke up. Ross's face lit up with a smile. Could this really be true? At this time, Ken was lying in the ward in a special cervical collar. A joyful commander came to him and asked, "Is he alive? Do you really think I'm going to die at the hands of this bastard?" Evans chuckled. You can't even breathe. Why are you showing off? The guy remarked caustically. The man looked at him with disdain and said, Well, let's say I can't breathe. It's not that bad. I also decorated him well. The brunette approached the chair and expressed admiration for his comrade. The captain sat down next to him, and Ken asked if Charlie himself had damaged anything. Ross waved his hand, declaring that nothing special had happened to him. A little here, a little there, a rib, an arm. The teacher asked him to tell his wife that he had been in an accident, but it turned out that the brunette had already done so. After that, he asked to take one cigarette from the inside pocket of his jacket, and these words made Charlie a little excited. He quickly walked over to the cupboard and expressed a desire to smoke one. I am a teacher, and the captain is a student. At least don't smoke in front of me, the man asked. It was too much for the guy. So he picked up the remote control from his friend's bed and pressed the button. Ken now assumed a sitting position. The captain gave him a cigarette and helped him light it. Evans took a drag with pleasure. However, he noticed something about the student. He was sniffing cigarette smoke, so the man warned that passive smoking is also harmful to the student's health. How rude, the young man remarked and frowned. And the teacher asked him to tell about what happened after he passed out. Charlie talked for a long time about everything that happened, and soon he finished his story, after which the man turned to him. Captain, I have 2 requests for you, one of which Ross had to fulfill. The first one sounded like this: tomorrow we'll just let Sharon go. The young man did not understand why Ken wanted to do this, but he explained his position, forget about his father's contract. Apparently he just wants to go back with Steven. You have nothing to worry. And he continued, You say you've dealt with Steven. What's more important now, your life or your father's contract? Ross tensed, thinking about what he had heard. But then he said, What do you think I will answer? Shut up, I'll kill Sharon, isn't that right? Ken asked. The comrade knew the captain very well, and he answered him exactly like that. Since the man expected this, he took a drag and made a second request. Take me to Steven, he said sternly. The guy asked, Does he really want this now? Ken explained that if they took him back to the hotel tomorrow, he would never see him again, and he needed to see the bastard. Ross agreed, as he understood the man's desire. The brunette stood up from his chair and walked towards the exit while Evans smoked. The student looked out of the room and ordered the bandits to find a chair for him, and Steven lay alone in his room, completely calm, until the noise of the opening door disturbed him. Footsteps and the sound of wheels approached across the floor. The blonde was very scared and began to ask who had come to him. Ken laughed and said contentedly, You did a pretty good job with him. And Charlie warned Steven in French that Darren had come to see him. He began to stutter in fear when pronouncing his name. This idiot doesn't know Korean, does he? Ken asked, and Charlie confirmed his guess, because the man, unlike them, had not been reborn. Evans sighed in disappointment, as it would now be difficult to talk to him one-on-one like before, but Charlie offered to help as a translator. Darren agreed and began to speak. Bastard, I've forgiven you, he said sternly. Ross didn't understand how to convey this to him. He looked at the bandaged Steven, and he grabbed the stroller saying, After tomorrow, live your whole life with the burden of betrayal. Your team, who died dishonorably because of you. At these words, the blond man cried out in bewilderment. Are you really the god of Blackfield? The commander asked him what he had thought before this, and the traitor admitted that he thought he had gone crazy. I lay there and thought about it, and eventually decided that it was Sharon trying to shake the password out of me, he continued. Ross wondered if Steven really thought Sharon would know that Charlie had almost killed him for almost raping a 16-year-old child. The man didn't know what to answer to this, but I decided to ask Darren to find out how much he owed him, since he had once borrowed. Ken explained to Ross that the bastard had once asked for money to go out with women, and had also stolen his wallet several times when Darren had left it in the tent. The young man asked Steven irritably if he had been stealing money from Darren. Captain, he shouted loudly throughout the entire ward. Charlie started to turn away from him, saying, If you still don't believe me, we're leaving. It's annoying. The blonde raised his hand convulsively, trying to explain, You died and then resurrected in another body. Is that possible? Ross didn't know the answer, but since that's how it happened, what could he do? Steven was silent, but he was very tense, and sweat was pouring down his face. Charlie said that he was going to give it to Sharon tomorrow. He didn't tell him the password, so he asked him to just go to France and not meet again. The only thing the blonde asked was if they had a cigarette. The young man consulted Darren about whether he should give it to him, but the man only had his extinguished one. In the end, they fulfilled his request and set it on fire. What a picture! The boy was indignant. Charlie Ross personally lighting cigarettes for his soldiers. Darren explained to him, Captain, you are simply the only one here who can move. Stephen noted that these Korean cigarettes tasted great, but Charlie asked him to shut up, as they were both really annoying him. However, here the blonde began to talk about part of Sharan's password, and it turned out that he knew him. Stephen shared that Gaunt's share was under his name, half from diamond sales, half from gangs, so if he just went to France, he would die. The young man was infuriated by the man beating around the bush, so Stephen said, "Protect me, then I will give you both passwords." The commander became furious at such unprecedented impudence. "Do you think we exchanged a few words and I forgave you?" Charlie had no desire to shake hands with the man who killed his guys, so he ordered him to stop talking nonsense and deal with Sharan himself. But before that, the guy assured him that he would work hard with him himself. Stephen tried to remember the name of the group, but he couldn't, and only named the Bampo Hotels and the hotel in front of Sichong. He explained that there are several groups from China and Japan there, and if tomorrow the blonde is handed over to Sharan, it will turn out that he deceived them, which is why he asked for help from Darren and Charlie. Things are getting serious. It would be much easier to just meet Sharan one-on-one. Ross guessed that it looked like the traitor was planning to send drugs to China and Japan, to which Stephen replied, "When you called me, I was just finishing the negotiations. They definitely won't stand by quietly while such a tasty morsel is taken away from them. In any case, you won't be able to live in Korea," the young man said. Stephen suggested making him the manager of the Korean office. "Already in Korean," the guy said, "he's completely gone," and Darren was surprised why the commander was smiling. Charlie told Ken their entire conversation, and after listening to him, Evan said, "First ask him how he knows Sharan's password. I don't think that with his brains he could fool Sharan. First of all, let's listen to what he says. And if it makes sense, then why wait until tomorrow? We just need to sign the contract before the Chinese and Japanese ruin everything for us." Ross laughed. "You can't fight as well as you used to, but your head works better." Darren smiled proudly, and the guy asked, "Then what? Should we make him the manager of Ganta in Korea?" "Well, if the captain wants it so much, then we can ask," the man answered. The brunette smiled. It wasn't that he wanted to, but wasn't the main thing for them to get money from him? Darren suggested to forget about it and just continue going to school and added, "I'm not good at English and French. Why doesn't he just forge documents and work here as a teacher, as a native speaker? Anyway, I don't think it's worth sending him to his death just for the sake of atonement." Ross suggested they talk about it later, and he asked Stephen how he knew Shafran's password. He was even interested in how this idiot managed to find out the password of such a sly guy. "God of Blackfield is his password," Stephen replied. Charlie was taken aback by what he heard. What? The guy was really angry at those bastards. But he decided to put this moment aside for now and find out how the blonde recognized him. The man replied that it happened by accident when he was dictating his password. One day, Sharan asked to call the bank and dictate his part of the password for withdrawing funds, before his password did not have numbers and was simply Smithin of Africa. But he simply got it wrong and accidentally blurted out, "God of Blackfield." He was told to give the second part of the password, after which he changed his password to Smithin 0702 of 00913 Africa. However, he even managed to find out part of Sharan's password. Ross couldn't believe this nonsense, that Sharan was stupid enough to choose such an easy password for such an important thing. The guy doubted whether this could be believed. "You don't trust me, do you?" he asked and explained that he himself couldn't believe it at first, but asked to trust him now, because later they could check, and if the password didn't work, kill him. The captain decided that since the man had given out the information without questioning, it was true. Stephen reminded them that they all knew that Sharan always looked out for his own ass, so the blonde would deal with the Chinese and Japanese first. "You?" Charlie asked him incredulously. He smiled and said, "Of course, Captain." Ross exhaled and continued listening to Stephen. He shouted so loudly that the cigarette almost fell out of his mouth. "Tomorrow, if you sign the contract and send me to France, the snakes will definitely finish me off." Why did he do this all of a sudden? The guy didn't understand. The captain asked if he would betray them again if they ended up together, and Stephen asked, "What do you think I should do?" After all, Sharan has no idea that the blonde knows his password. They had no dealings with gangs before, but Sharan, out of greed, decided to buy shares in Gaunt with money borrowed from the gang, and not only in his own name but also in Stephen's name. So if the blonde wants to live, he will have to pay off his debts upon returning to France. If the money disappears, he will die, and Sharan will simply make a new plan. After listening to him carefully, Charlie thought about it. "Captain, you have already deprived me of one eye and one arm. Let me live, save me," the man begged. Ross remained silent, not answering him. Here Ken decided to intervene in their conversation and asked the captain what this puppy had been talking about all this time. To which the guy replied, "In a nutshell, We need to catch Sharon and save him. Evans asked the young man what he had decided. But clenching his fists in anger, Charlie commanded that it was up to Darren, whom Stephen had almost killed, to decide. Comrade, as he said earlier, let the blonde live. Ross was worried. Will you be okay? Ken turned towards the traitor and looked at him, and after which he confidently said, yes. They soon left Stephen's room. In the corridor, Charlie immediately gave the bandits the task of calling Guantok. One of them immediately carried out the order and dialed his number. Yes, I'm passing the phone, Charlie and Darren heard, and the man approached them, handing them a smartphone. Guantok immediately asked, so what? Ross told that there were about 10 Chinese and Japanese sitting in the Saigon and Bampo hotels who would definitely buy drugs. The bandit got angry from such news. These bastards decided to go international. What was the name of the gang? However, the guy did not know this yet. Guantek assured them that they would quickly deal with such a large number of people, and the young man asked for a room at Namsan. The bandit said he would pass this on to Dosok and asked if the guy would be in the hospital and should he call him on this number? To which Ross responded positively. After some time, Guantek himself came to the hospital and, entering the ward, he smiled and said, you were shaken up quite a bit, but we held out. The young man answered him and asked, you didn't come to visit someone sick, what do you need? It turned out that they found all the foreigners and are now dealing with them. So what next? Charlie asked. The man smiled and asked, won't you go? Me? Ross exclaimed menacingly. The guy turned to the bandit in a cold tone. Is it really that you can't do this yourself? The man got angry. What are you talking about? Frowning, the brunette explained, if you're afraid, then speak directly. Guantok couldn't stand it and raised his voice. Can you speak more clearly? The young man replied, clear your territory, help with this and that. Do you want me to do everything you say? The bandit made a stopping gesture with his hand and asked him to wait. He asked indignantly, did you really just think that I'm calling you to fight with those bastards you take me for? In anger, he continued to explain that he had called him to come along so that he could help him assess the situation and see everything with his own eyes. Did he really think that of all people, Guantek would ask a schoolboy to deal with his affairs? The man was furious about this. However, he was interrupted by Charlie, who said, I don't need to know the details, that's all, of course, I still owe you. So I'll fulfill one request of yours. And he added, but other than that, let's not cross paths anymore. Guantok laughed and called him a little puppy. Okay, since you helped me take over all of Gangnam, you don't owe me anything more. It's all over between us, are you satisfied? His screams could be heard even by those passing by in the corridor. Ross also ordered him to remove all the guys from the hospital. The bandit couldn't stand such rudeness. This hospital is an important place for us. We are not here because of you, so my guys are staying. The man turned towards the exit, and he put the guy in his place. Don't even dare dictate your terms. Besides, we dealt with the foreigners, not you. To this, Charlie replied, because it is your job, not mine. Leaving the ward, Guantok wished him all the best and advised him to study hard. Otherwise, he would end up in a gang. He walked away irritably, saying, you've ruined the whole mood. Let's go. Now Charlie and Ken were left alone. Evans asked why the captain behaved like that. What do you mean? He answered him. Evans didn't understand why the young man was doing this to Guantok. Was it really worth going that far? Darren, think about it. They are a criminal group. We, in your opinion, are gangsters. What have you been fighting for all this time? Ross turned to Comrade. Of course, Charlie was grateful to this bandit for a lot, but it was necessary to draw a line between them as soon as possible. They would solve their problems on their own, and we would deal with Sharon. The comrade exhaled, because the captain was right. The brunette began to think, looking at the exit from the ward. He looked at Darren and asked him to get some good sleep while he was sick. And you? Ken was worried, but the guy assured him that he would soon go to bed too. However, first he needed to deal with someone. A few hours later, morning came. Only after waking up did Darren see the captain awake next to him. Charlie admitted it was a bit strange, to which the man, not understanding, asked what he was talking about. The guy, examining himself, continued, the body is much. Darren immediately began to ask anxiously, what? Everything hurts. Should I call a doctor? But Ross turned around and explained with a smile, better. Evans looked questioningly at the captain, and the young man, while warming up, declared that it still hurt a little. But if you compare it to yesterday, it's like night and day. Charlie wondered if this was really possible in just one day. Darren decided to use the remote control to raise the bed to a sitting position. And he said, does this surprise you more than the fact that we died and were reborn? Although you are right, there is no need to look for an explanation for everything. The main thing is that you recovered quickly. The young man approached the phone and agreed with his friend. Ross called and asked for the use of an ambulance. He explained that they knew he couldn't tell the truth anyway. After that, the guy smiled and thanked him. And having finished the conversation, he hung up the phone. Then he began to get dressed, asking his friend to take care of himself. "Are you sure everything is okay?" Darren was worried. "You are going there alone." "Of course it's not okay," the young man replied, "but it's better than having you following me around." The brunette mockingly said that he could do without such a burden, which angered Evans. Ken asked the captain to be careful, and he watched him until he walked out the door. After this, the man took out his cigarettes and lit one. A little later, Charlie and Steven were riding in an ambulance. "Are we really going to be just the two of us?" the man asked. Ross didn't understand why he was so worried, because it was not the first time he had been on the battlefield. But the blonde explained that he had never fought in such a state. "Calm down, everything will be fine," said the captain. Steven sighed nervously and clenched his teeth, so they continued to ride in complete silence. Soon the car finally arrived at the Namsan Hotel. She drove down to the underground parking lot, and after she stopped, Charlie sat Steven down in the chair. A man in a suit immediately ran up to meet them. He asked, "Are you Mr. Charlie Ross?" And when he realized that this was the one he needed, he said, "I was warned in advance. I will take you to the room." They entered the elevator together, and the man pressed the floor button, after which he began to rummage through his jacket pocket and look for something. It was a room card, which he handed to the boy, explaining, "Suite room at the end of the hall, room 1701. After a while, they reached their floor and Charlie took Steven into the room. They sat together in the room and did not talk. The captain watched the time. The clock already showed 9 o'clock. So he decided to call Sharon and reached for the phone. The guy said, "I would like to contact one of the guests, Mr. Sharan." And very soon a man's voice sounded on the phone and Charlie said, "Room 1701. If you want to check, come alone." Sharan was afraid that he would be attacked, but the young man reminded him that they had already agreed and he had no reason to do something so senseless.